The reason for uploading this video today is simply that it's the 100th anniversary of a meeting taking place. I'll start by showing a short video of my going through the race card. Given its age, unsurprisingly it's not in the greatest condition, and I'll do in a short while what I've done in my other videos and just go through the pictures of each page. The first question to answer here is, where is Kempton Park? This should be a simple question to answer, but it isn't. Here is a map showing the areas Surrey has gained and lost over the years, and the pink section is where Kempton Park is. This Surrey County Council map shows the administrative borders of Surrey. I've added in a high-tech manner the names of two London boroughs of Hounslow and Richmond, and obviously Kempton Park is in Surrey. Is it also at the top of the homepage of the website of Kempton Park Racecourse? It says Surrey, and this is at the bottom of the same homepage which doesn't say Surrey. Oh dear! The problem is the 1965 creation of the Greater London Council, more commonly known as the GLC and now known as the Greater London Authority. Almost all of Middlesex went into Greater London. However, a small part of the north moved into administrative borders of Hertfordshire. More pertinently to this question, a small part of the south east went into administrative borders of Surrey. However, Royal Mail kept the postal designation of Middlesex for this area for decades. So that, as I will point out in a later video, Greater London nearly had 4 racecourses at one point under original plans produced by Royal Commission on Local Government in Greater London in 1960. There would have been the now closed Alexander Park racecourse in the north of London, there's Kempton Park, Sandown Park in the south east, and also Epsom Town was part of the plans for certain. The racecourse is to the south of the town, so whether it would have ended up in Greater London or not would depend on how the boundary was drawn. So either Kempton Park is now in somewhere it was never originally part of, none of the pre-1965 Surrey was north of the Thames, and with a one postcode, at least in the Middlesex part, or part of a county council, Middlesex, abolished in 1965. By the way, the area has never been part of London, which is why looking again at the south east a section of looking again at the Surrey map, the administration of the London Irish rugby team is historically based there, and they used to play matches at that ground but now play in London. They also use Middlesex as part of their address. I'll show a course description from the earliest copy of Rough Guide I know to feature Kempton Park, this is available online as a PDF, and from a winter version from 1883, 5 years after Kempton opened. And this one is from my copy of Rough's Guide covering the 1921 season. Clearly the information here is much more extensive. Race cards, often until the 1980s, would show the meeting officials on the front page. Usually they're now shown on the third page. As can be seen, race cards got their name for the simple reason they used to be printed on card. The modern race card is much more extensive, for if you ignore the adverts, the main differences are that they give more general information, have a map, and also short analysis of the chances of each one in each race. Going through the names of the stewards, the Earl of Derby was a major racecourse owner who owned at least 2 winners at all 5 classics. The competed states were following about him. Many good stories are told of Lord Derby, doing the following, which is surely apocryphal, not least because he was a man of utter probity. He was spotted by a steward feeding one of his horses shortly before the race. When challenged, his lordship explained the substance was sugar and promptly ate a lump himself to show as innocuous. Keep the creature on a tight rein until a furlong out, then let him have his head, he'll do the rest. His lordship added almost an overthought. If you hear anything coming up behind you, don't worry and turn round, it'll only be me. The Earl of Coventry owned 2 Grand National winners in 1963 and 1964. Yes, a steward for this meeting was in his 80s. The Earl of Durham doesn't have an obvious racing connection, though he's related to George Lambton, a well-known jockey and trainer. Again, Lord Farquhar has no obvious racing connections, and Burke's Peerage describes him as a cavalier financier and conduit for a subscription to party political funds, both Conservative and Lloyd George Liberal, for aspirants to titles as the full extent of his regular business dealings came apparent after his death, he was considered lucky to escape prosecution while alive, pretty much cash for honours. But lucky things have moved on in the last 100 years. Lord Glanley also owned winners of all 5 classics. R.W.B. Jardine was Sir Robert William Buchanan Jardine, and will appear in this video in a later way. Thomas Galloway owned Leinster, who at Aintree won the 1903 Grand Sefton Chase and the 1904-1910 Champion Chase, being Principal Medical Officer of British Forces in India, and his wife had £500 of jewellery stolen in May 1923. Not by me, if anyone thinks I've been around it since 1921. For handicapper, Major W.F. Lee was William Frederick Lee, who had done this role for a couple of decades. The judge here, C.E. Robinson, or Charlie Robinson, had a few years later, having had this role as the main Jockey Club judge for decades. Probably his most famous time in the world was the 1913 Derby. This race isn't only known for the tragic death of suffragette Emily Davison. First past the post was favourite Craigennor and second 101 shot Abbott. After some interference had taken place, the stewards decided to object to the result, rather than the jockey in second place objecting and replacing the change with Craigennor disqualified. A controversy stems from Craigennor's owner Charles Ismay and the main steward involved, Eustace Loader. Ismay had conducted an affair with the wife of Loader's twin brother, and there was also anger that Ismay's older brother Bruce had survived the sinking of a Titanic the previous year, and was going to be certain connection with White Star Liner with Bruce, not Charles Ismay wasn't, but Ismay was very connected with White Star Liner. The clerk of the Scales, Albert Manning, was a son of Charles Manning, who had previously held the role. Automatically, reports with Even News of previous November 1920 wrote he had been taken seriously ill, had to have an operation, or was in a grave condition that prayers were being said for him in church. The Scotsman Yorkshire Post the next day wrote it was in reality an operation of minor importance, and his medical attendants were pretty satisfied with its progress. The Secretary, W.J. Davidson, was also later the Secretary of Race Courses Association. He was also clerk of course at many race courses. The Times racing correspondent gave him a glowing obituary when he died in 1939. Thomas F. Dawkins held many roles in racing, including handicapper, clerk of a course at Hurst Park as well as Kempton, secretary to Warwick Racecourse, and a member of Racecourse Betting Control Board. The Tackler in 1930 called him one of the turf's most popular personalities, and his time one of the best handicappers the Jockey Club ever had. But the race card hasn't been defaced by some very excitable person. The next page shows that all the race cards were signed with the secretary to show they were authentic. It's interesting here to see a horse is called All Right, rather than weighed in, as now, to confirm the result is final. I've been to Horse Racing Ireland a few times, and the phrase, I think it is, your winner's all white, is still used there. And another note, again, you got for decades in racecar's text about what flags were used when. Race times are noted here as well, for both the railway station and racecourse opened in 1878. It does appear racecourse ticket affected where you caught the train from. There are not as many horses running as it appears on these race cards. Until March 1961, British racing didn't have overnight declarances, lagging behind the rest of the world due to the opposition of the Jockey Club and the owners. So not every horse listed here ran, which is why some decided to note which horses were running by obviously putting a mark by them, and it's even possible a horse to run without even being on the card. Now my 953 Epsom Derby, if I remember right, I think a horse was expected to win the Derby and it was due declared, and actually won the final race, but all the newspapers thought he won the Derby, not in the race he ran in. This race meeting took place under harder going, which is even quicker than firm going, but racing is banned from taking place under this going description now. The last British meeting with hard ground was the Taunton Jumps meeting in 1996. So going through the horses here, Valentine Court is clearly named from Messiah Valens, or Valens, I'm not sure how you would pronounce it in that case, and the Dam Court Beauty. Santa Claus, a obvious Christmas-related name, was then went on to be used for another much more well-known horse, who in 1964 Irish 2,000 guineas for Epsom Derby and the Irish Derby. Big Bertha was the name of a huge First World War German gun. Madden and Flesh won this race and was owned and trained by Mr. H.O. Madden, and this must be Herbert Odo Madden, the thermal jockey, and I'll link his extensive Docupedia article. Otto Madden, as he was known, was born in Germany to English parents. He died in 1942. The family contacted many papers who published their request, making clear he was not German, as a number of obituaries had written he was born there. Clearly this was due to it happening in the middle of World War II and being known as Otto. Madden Fleck was written by Billy Speck, and again I'll link his Docupedia article. 1920, she made her debut in a 5-furlong race at Newmarket Rolling Mile course on May the 11th, where she was unplaced. She was owned by Mrs. Arthur James, according to the Whole Daily Mail, and by Otto Madden, according to the Yorkshire Evening Post. Whole Daily Mail is the only reference to Mrs. James and the horse, and given the horse above in declarations on the card as owned by Mrs. James, it looks like someone's just accidentally copied her name to Madden Fleck. Madden Fleck herself then finished third at the Old Derby racecourse in September, and then the same month was unplaced again, winning at Newmarket Rolling Mile. In 1921, she was unplaced at Newmarket Rolling Mile in May. The Sporting Chronicle correspondent fancied her for a seller at the Old Hurst Park course which used to be in Surrey. That was in July, but she was also unplaced. She was third at Hurst Park in August, again fancied by the Sporting Chronicle journalist. After the race, he said she couldn't go the pace but stayed on well. Later that month, the Nottingham Evening Post gave her a chance in a race at Derby, but bluntly said the field were a poor lot, but again she wasn't placed. After winning the seller on today's card I'm looking at, Otto Madden bought her back for 165 guineas. Nottingham Evening Post wrote that she started her back before bursting through to win by half a length. The Yorkshire Post felt Billy Speck won the Well-Timed Challenge, and the Sheffield Independent also liked his riding of her, and the Sporting Chronicle felt she was lucky to get a gap. I wonder if I hadn't tipped her this time around. In April 1922, she was unplaced at Leicester and also at Nottingham in May, then third at Yarmouth in June on harder going. So second in Nottingham later that month, which the Pall Mall Gazette thought was a good run. They gave her a chance in a Leicester race in July, but she didn't run there. She did though won that month at Hurst Park, fancied by the Yorkshire Post, but again wasn't placed, and again wasn't placed at August at the same course. London Daily News fancied her at Newmarket Rolling Mile that month, but again she was a non-runner, and this shows you out of the farce of guesswork before overnight the clearances came in, and as I said in March 1961, another 40 years of this. She then won by a neck and won off 1.5 furlongs back at Yarmouth in September. Western Morning News praised the riding of the apprentice R.A. Jones, who's probably Bobby Jones. That jockey won for St Ledger the next year, but Docupedia writes that the Earl of Lonsdale, who owned the horse, didn't give him what he promised for winning that race. The Scotsman wrote around about now that Mademoiselle Fleck was owned by Otto Madden's one-time partner, Van Verparty. There's no doubt that Madden trained horses for the Belgian-born Madden Verparty, who died in a car accident in late 1920 after visiting Madden's training establishment. The Sporting Times wrote after her death that she dug the wealthy Otto Madden out of retirement to become her trainer. However, the Scotsman article is the only reference to ever having specifically owned Mademoiselle Fleck, so it could be a mistake. The Yorkshire Post fancied her to win later in October at the former Yorkshire course of Stockton, but she wasn't placed with the Sheffield Daily Telegraph saying she started badly. Given Stockton Racecourse is south of the new River Tees, although north of the old River Tees, I think it was in Yorkshire, not County Durham. Anyway, Doug Moskop once wrote it was in Yorkshire, and that will do for me. He was also placed in Warwick in November, when that course still had flat racing as well as jumps racing. In April 1923, she was placed again at Warwick, and then placed at Yarmouth in May, and also at Nottingham in July. That month, the Sportsman newspaper mentioned for a race she didn't run in. They said her form wasn't good as last year, when she would have run this sort of race in a trot. The Whole Daily Mail in September said she had picked up an injury a few weeks earlier and couldn't run again in the Yarmouth race she'd run the year before. In November, she had a final career run when unplaced at Aintree on the flat on heavy going. That racecourse for most of the 20th century was known as Liverpool, and had at that point a flat course as well as a nice hunt course. In January 1929, the Dublin Sport wrote she was a Broodmare and Madison stud in Ireland, and in February 1932, the Belfast Telegraph wrote she'd given birth to a dark chestnut filly. Pedigreequery.com she was sent to Norway in 1933, I assume for breeding. Ganymede would be named after either the moon of Jupiter discovered by Galileo, or the cupbearer of Zeus, for whom the moon was named. Weed Killer, it appears to be a pun named after a combination of his sire Florist and the dam Kill Hill. Lucky Flight won this race, and is clearly named after her sire Flying Orb and her dam Lucky Star. She was owned by Whiskey Baron Lord Dewar, and I assume it was Thomas Dewar rather than his brother John Dewar. Both were lords, but Thomas Dewar's Wikipedia article mentions his interest in horse racing. Interestingly, Thomas Dewar being a Conservative MP, while his brother John had been a Liberal MP. She was trained by Pickering. This would be Samuel George Pickering, as Worth's Guide to that year has him as the only trainer of that surname. Greyhound Derby website writes he trained for 37 years, including winners of every major race bar the Classics. She was ridden by Belgian-born Henry Gellis, who had 3 Classic winners, including the 1929 Oaks. His father, Charles, had been Belgian champion jockey 13 times. And I include a picture here I have of Henry Gellis. In 1921, Lucky Flight had been a possible winner earlier this season in March in the Brocklesby Stakes. In those days ran at the old Lincoln Racecourse rather than now at Doncaster. And she actually made a debut at Lingfield Park on July the 9th, where she was unplaced and harder going. Western Mail had mentioned it in an article that day, and the Yorkshire Post had stated she was a dark youngster, and the Sporting Chronicle felt she would no doubt win races, but preferred another horse in the race. They also unplaced at Kempton in August, who finished second at Windsor in September, where the Yorkshire Post felt she had a chance in that race. The Sporting Chronicle after the race wrote that she'd wrecked the chance of a favourite by swerving at the start of a 5-furlong race. She then won this 5-furlong selling race. I'm looking at it on today's card at Kempton back in October. The Nottingham Evening Post and the Sporting Chronicle felt she would win. She beat Lucky Fan in second place, who was a horse it interfered with at Windsor. Dewar brought Lucky Flight back for 470 guineas after she won the Seller, and finally she was emplaced in a flat race at Aintree in November, despite being fancied by the Sporting Chronicle, and the Staffordshire Senator said she started slowly. And in 22, so only 2 further career ones, where she was placed in 2 selling handicaps. First at Leicester in April, and then June at Derby Day at Epsom. In the latter race, the Yorkshire Post wrote she was a moderate horse, but still felt she was a slight preference in the race. Pillar of Salt is clearly named after a biblical story, especially as the dam is called Lot's wife. Abbott's Trace would be named after his sire Tracery and his dam Abbott's Anna. He won the Newmarket St Leger, Liverpool Summer Cup and the Stockton St Leger. Paragon won this race, and his full brother Clarissimus had won the 2,000 guineas, and his dam Quincentus had won the 1,000 guineas. He was owned by George Ernest Paget, who was a former chairman of the Midland Railway Company and also director of Nottingham Racecourse. He'd been a lieutenant colonel with the Yorkshire Yeomanry, and he also owned Rijeka, who won the 1922 Cambridgeshire. Paragon was trained by Peter Valentine Purcell Gilpin. Peter Gilpin was champion trainer in 1904, and that year trained Pretty Polly, who won the Phillies Triple Crown of 1,000 guineas, Oaks and St Leger, and a race at Newmarket and also at the Curragh is named after her. In 1920 he also trained Conrad to win the first ever Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe. He trained 2 Sir Irish winners and was nicknamed the Wizard of Clarehaven. He also owned Delaney, who won the King's Stand and July Cup, but winning the latter at odds of 50-1 on against only one opponent. Gilpin had actually been born Peter Purcell, was married to a niece of Sir Richard Gilpin, and they inherited property on the condition that the couple take the name Gilpin. Paragon was ridden by 18-year-old Arthur Balding, who was Gilpin's apprentice at the time, and Balding went on to win the 1927,000 guineas on Cresta 1. He also went on to have a very long training career of 57 years, and a comment on the Betfair forum says he was a top trainer at Hamilton in the 1960s. Between 1991 and 2008 there was a race named at Hamilton Racecourse, named after Arthur and his wife Dorothy. He had 15 children, and his son John, who took over the trading licence when his father died, said his mum did all the entries for horses running with his dad during the training. In 1919 Paragon finished second on his debut on July the 15th at Newmarket July Course. For the race, Leicester Daily Post had seen he was one of the best youngsters of Gilpin's horses. The Daily Mirror afterwards wrote that great things were expected of him and he'd done well running green. If you don't know what that means, it meant he ran like he was inexperienced. Dublin Sport had a similar view. Later that month he was third at Hurst Park, but Belfast Telegraph felt he'd been beaten by good horses in his first 2 races. His first win was at Sandown on Hard Going in August, and for some reason this was technically a Kempton fixture ran at Sandown. The Yorkshire Post wrote he won in good style and was a bargain for Ernest Paget, who had bought him for 720 guineas as a yearling when sold by the executors of his breeder, the late Lord Falmouth. However, the Leeds Mercury was less impressed and felt Paragon had been a lucky winner. Winhurst in the Daily Courier split the difference by writing Paragon did no more than he expected of him by winning. Another horse, Charles Surface, who we'll look at later in this video, also won on this day. In August, Paragon gained a second victory, this time at Derby. Winners had tipped him for the race, and to the Birmingham Daily Gazette. The Sheffield Evening Telegraph rather confusingly writes that Paget was always interested in the welfare of the Derby meeting. This relates to the Derby racecourse, not the Derby meeting at Epsom. Ernest Paget was the steward at the Pacific Derby meeting, and I fear that may not be allowable these days. Scotsman Robbie Advertiser was surprised he was allowed to start as high as 108 in the betting. And at 108, we had some other unusual betting odds in those days. We're certainly unusual look now at times. And the former newspaper felt he would now go for 5,000 guineas. Fortunatus from the Daily Telegraph said he was splendidly bred. The Daily Mirror's gossip column wrote it was a black day for bookmakers at Derby, as the Waywoman had backed Paragon. As I said earlier, St Ernest was the head of the Midland Railway Company. In October, Paragon had his sole unplaced run with 5th at Newmarket Rolling Mile course, although Fortunatus had felt he'd be hard to beat. Finally, he was second back at Derby Racecourse in November. The Exeter and Plymouth Gazette had tipped him feeling he'd been kept for this race. This was rather dramatic, as the false start, a majority of the field had gone halfway down the course before pulling up. The London Daily News wrote that the majority of backers were disappointed by the winding of Smith, feeling he'd challenged too late. 1920, the Sheffield Daily Telegraph mentioned Paragon was doing very well on the gallops, and mentioned the possibility of the Quaver or Esher Cup. The London Weekly Dispatch made similar comments, feeling he might just be kept for 2,000 guineas, for which he was considerably fancied. But John Bull felt he'd wintered uncommonly well. He was top weight for the Esher Cup at the end, but didn't run. Sheffield Daily Telegraph stated he'd galloped nicely over 10 furlongs at home, and would take a whole lot of beating the next day's 2,000 guineas, and indeed stepping up in class in April. He was third in the 2,000 guineas at the Rolling Mile course at 8-1. In May, he returned to headquarters with second place in valuable Newmarket Freehold Stakes. The Daily Mirror felt he ran well on losing by 3/4 of a length to the Guinea second at Allenby. Later that month, he won at Lingfield. London Weekly Dispatch felt it was a poor race as 2 of the 4 runners weren't fancied at all, and there were issues at the start which played into the hands of Paragon, with one of the 2 outsiders effectively left at the start. Sheffield Daily Telegraph also mentioned issues at the start and felt his main rival looked off colour and was sweating. Scotsman was more impressed by Paragon's win. London Weekly Dispatch felt he had a good chance in the Royal Hunt Cup at Ascot in June. However, London Daily News wrote he'd been scratched later as it felt too much as a task for a 3-year-old under the weight, and said it was bad news for anti-post punters. No change of air. Indeed, he ran the Queen's Vase at a meeting when he started 6-4 favourite. It was held up to make the 2-mile trip before moving to second place on the home turn, having faded into 4th place. Daily Mirror had felt it was a tip in itself, and he ran in that way to run the Hunt Cup, but probably feared he wouldn't stay in the trip. I said Sporting and Dramatic News afterwards felt something could have been wrong with the horse, as it looked like he was going to win by 6 lengths, into fading badly. Amusingly, the journalist wrote that Paragon looked like a dog at a fair in running all over the place down the home straight. Paragon ran the possibility of a Cambridge handicap back at Newmarket Rolling Mile, but didn't run. 1921 in May, he won the valuable Great Jubilee handicap at Kempton. This race I still remember being prestigious in the late 1980s and watched on Channel 4. And I link an interesting article by Greg Wood from 2011 about the decreasing importance of the race, and sadly it now no longer exists. Paragon won by a head, and the Daily Mirror said he and the second horse Blue Dun were 2 of the gamest horses in training. White Knight Leeds Mercury and also the Nottingham Post journalists both felt Blue Dun was a little unlucky not to win. The Illustrated Sporting and Dramatic News, in a review of Flat Season in December, felt quite a few people had this view. The Daily News pointed out that Paget had very few horses in training. Paragon finished 5th at Royal Ascot in June Royal Hunt Cup, with possibility as top weight in the Hartington Handicap at Nottingham in July, but instead ran in the Liverpool Cup that month for flat at Aintree on hard ground. So for Daily Telegraph felt he never looked better on gallops. Sunday Post, Western Morning News, Manchester Evening News, and Sporting Times all strongly fancied him for the Liverpool race, but he finished 4th, beaten 10 lengths. Star Greenland liked him for 2 races in August at Redcar, then at Derby, if he won with them, but he didn't. When Belfast Newsletter also fancied him for the Derby race, but said the recent hard ground was all against him, and that he'd been not doing too much training work. I suspect that the hard ground was why he wasn't running very much. The Sporting Chronicle and also the Northern Whig felt he was well treated in the weights for the Cambridge Handicap. Sporting Chronicle later in September felt he looked short of work while running at Aintree and looked on the liberal handicap mark now, as they felt he might win whatever his next race was, and even more so on good ground. The Sheffield Daily Telegraph never wanted to fancy him for the Cambridgeshire, and their journalists felt Paragon improved his winning the Jubilee Handicap. Paragon was a possible top weight for the Newmarket Jockey Club Stakes, but the Nottingham Evening Post felt the 1 mile 6 furlong trip would be too far for him. For Sunday Mirror, another paper to like him for the Cambridgeshire. Paragon in the end reappeared at the October race meet I'm looking at today to win by a head leading all the way. Sporting Chronicle thought it was a great race. Leeds at Mercury had tipped Paragon for this race. The Scotsman after the race felt that horse of the courses are playing nowhere stronger than Kempton, with Paragon having won the Jubilee Handicap back in May. Illustrated Sporting and Dramatic News are surprised at the prize Paragon was returned, but I talked to Paget before the race, and he'd not been too keen on the horse's chances. However, Western Morning News, for a couple of weeks later, that Abbott should have won. A bizarre story emerged in the Derby Daily Telegraph on December 30th that year concerning Captain Owen Peel returning £3,500 he'd won on Paragon in the race. That would be just worth over £100,000 nowadays. Apparently betting horse with about 40 bookmakers, but a post office delay meant his telegrams making the bet were delivered a few minutes after the result was known. The paper wrote that bookmakers invariably accepted dated telegram as being acceptable as a legitimate bet, of it had been abused. The paper said that Captain Peel may be commended by some on his actions, as he felt the closeness of the dispatch of telegrams with running of a race was an issue. However, they felt the racing world in general could consider him foolish, because if Paragon had lost, he'd been expected to pay the stakes he'd bet with. They felt he must be a wealthy man, as there was no reason to return the money he was clearly entitled to, and they couldn't understand why he'd acted in this way. This contrasts with that of a well-known society person whose mother had owned Poffilin, who won the 1919 Grand National. The Flintshire County Herald later that year had written in glowing terms, mentioning that man's wedding to his daughter Sir Robert Jardine was a leading racing owner in 1920, and this was the same Jardine who I said earlier was a steward at today's Kempton meeting. Later this man, not Jardine, was described as one of the most popular young men in society. Anyway, one bookmaker declined to pay a bet made by telegram by this person, and the post office is investigating. Next February, Postmaster General took out a summons about the issue. It was against Captain Owen Peel. Yes, the Derby Daily Telegraph's confusion of the issue was now explainable. The allegation was that Mr. and Mrs. Peel had used the influence of a local postmaster to time the telegrams the bets were handed in. Captain Peel had admitted the wrong times on the telegrams, which was an offence in itself, but prosecution stated they would show evidence that the result was already known to a couple. Winning money was now claimed to be £4,500 rather than £3,500. Captain Peel said he placed such a large bet because his trainer had told him the horse was a good thing, but Galpin, who was trained the horse, denied this in court. The Pall Mall Gazette said the court was full of well-known racing society people. There was massive press interest in the case. The Pall Mall Gazette reported sensation on March 7th as Captain Peel suddenly pleaded guilty, with his wife pleading not guilty. This apparently came to a surprise to all. On March 13th, Captain Peel's chauffeur was fined £10 driving Captain Peel's car without a licence. This has nothing to do with the case. I'm just pointing out the captain could afford a bleeding chauffeur, so shouldn't really have needed the money at all. Next day, the captain was sentenced to 12 months imprisonment and wormwood scrubs. A moment of humour in court came when one bookmaker's representative said Captain Peel had been a satisfactory client, which the judge replied, "What, does that mean he generally lost?" to laughter in court. It became clear that Captain Peel's father was the person who had paid back the money in December, although I don't know how he found out what the Peels had done. Mrs. Peel was acquitted in the case of the steed being backed. Part of the reason was the wife was seen as being under influence of her husband if committing this sort of crime. Justice Darling stated that this was by then an absurd legal situation, and if he really believed Captain Pillar coerced his wife, he'd have given him a larger sentence than he did. Reminded of a scene from Dickens' Oliver Twist, which was published in the late 1830s. It was all Mrs. Bumble, she would do it, urged Mr. Bumble, first looking round to ascertain his partner left the room. That is no excuse, returned Mr. Brownlow. You were present on the occasion of the destruction of these trinkets, and indeed are more guilty of the two in the eye of the law, for the law supposes your wife acts under your direction. If the law supposes that, said Mr. Bumble, squeezing his hat emphatically in both hands, law is an ass, an idiot. If that's the eye of the law is a bachelor, and the worst I can wish for law is that his eye may be opened by experience. By experience! Harry Seacombe in the musical Oliver did that scene and Mr. Bumble much better. Only 2 weeks later, the case was the subject of debate in the House of Lords, coming directly after a long debate after the Irish Free State. Viscount Ullswater directly referenced Mr. Bumble. In May, the Lord Chancellor appointed a committee to look into the law relating to wife's responsibility in these sort of cases, and the law was radically changed in 1925, and articles at the time talking of the Lord Chancellor making reforms did actually directly reference the case of appeals. Captain Peel was released late in December after serving 9 months due to good behaviour. By February he was back with his local hunt. In March 1927 the Peels had been divorced due to adultery by the captain, and Mrs. Peel gained custody of their child, who sadly died in World War II. Mrs. Peel married John Drummond, the Laird of Mettock. Drummond's sister was the first British woman to serve a full apprenticeship as an engineer. It goes to show the complete farce of the situation on Mrs. Peel's not guilty verdict given the times we're now living in. She gained £100,000 in 1920s prices when her father died. September 1928, Kempton Peel was involved in a legal argument over the purchase of a horse, but he lost that case. He was being paid £125 a month by the now Mrs. Drummond, but she managed to have that stopped. Back to a career Paragon. Remarkably, after his Kempton win, he ran only 2 days later in the Champion Stakes, and those days still ran at Newmarket Rolling Mile and over a mile and a half, for his third of 4 runners. Winner in Dundee Courier wrote it being unreasonable to run Paragon at Newmarket only 2 days after Gruden race at Kempton, which is mild compared to the Newcastle Daily Chronicle, whose comments included the phrase, "Thus the temporal constitution of good horses are ruined." And felt in the circumstances it actually ran well. But the Chronicle felt he looked less well in the paddock and Newmarket than he had at Kempton. Also felt Kempton's opening quarter mile downhill and the bend suited speed better than at the straight at Newmarket. Illustrated Sporting and Dramatic News quoted Paget as saying Paragon had beaten Orpheus twice in the past, so it was worth running him again at Newmarket. In the end, Paragon didn't win the game, which I mentioned earlier as a possible engagement. White and Knight in the Leeds Mercury felt this wasn't a surprise given his 10-pound penalty winning at Kempton, putting on a big weight of 9 stone 7 pounds. Daily Record agreed, and also given how well he'd been beaten at Newmarket. The bystander in November wondered if Paragon won in Derby's Marquesan Plate despite a high weight due to Paget being keen at winning at the course, but he didn't win. 1922, he had won final career race when winning the City and Suburban Handicap at Epsom in April. Western Morning News, Sheffield Daily Telegraph and the Sporting News have been very impressed by the way he'd been working before the races. Palmer Gazette almost liked him for the race, especially he felt he was a genuine horse and started quickly, and afterwards they wrote he was a fine horse who comfortably made all the running. Daily Mirror wrote that he went off like a shot from a gun at the start, and their front page had a picture of him winning the race. This race was also the first win of the country for his Californian jockey George Archibald. Westminster Gazette stated Paragon looked like the thick-set, big-barreled, powerful horse he was the year before. Northern Regal next month made similar comments. I remember reading circa 15 years ago that North American turf horses tend to have this sort of profile, as turf courses are often inside their dirt tracks, and I wonder if this build helped Paragon take tracks such as Kempton and Epsom. The Birmingham Daily Gazette felt it was a great win under his heavy weight. Western Morning News felt it was a fine performance in a quick time. The Truth also wrote about weight kind performance, saying his 9-stone burden was one that few horses had run the race under. It was mentioned as a possibility one of the Jubilee Handicap run the year before, however is now due to carry a £10 penalty. What a reason he didn't run here, or indeed ever again. Paragon was picked from Gilpin's stable to train at college leader in early June along with 4 other horses, and a couple of articles made it clear that Paragon was intending to continue racing. However, this never happened, and in July he was sold for 7,000 guineas, having opened the bidding at 4,000 guineas. It was intended to go abroad, and the Gloucester Echo said the actual buyer's name was not revealed, by the British Bloodstock Agency, who bought them on their behalf. Malindo won the Coronation Cup in 1920. Illuminator won the 1921 Wall Hunt Cup. Grand Court won the Liverpool Spring Cup in 1922. Black Gown won the 1923 Challenge Stakes. Charbel won the 1920 Epsom Oaks. The Alder won the 1920 Gordon Stakes. Flamboyant won the 1921 Doncaster Cup and 1922 Goodwood Cup. Winter King won the 1921 Lowther Stakes and 1922 Churchill Stakes. William Malone will be named after an early 19th century Irish song. Highlander, I mentioned him in my second Thornbury Racecourse video, and I'll repeat my comment from there. Given there's a few horses with this name, there can't be only one. Donna Bucket won the 1921 Coronation Stakes. Lady Sleeper is listed twice in this race card and only won the last race on this card, and Sirra is in 2 races as well. I was saying with the issue of overnight declarances not being in, you sometimes see horses declared in 2 races and you don't know if they're going to which were won in, and some of them didn't win in either of them. But as I say, Lady Sleeper did definitely win the final race I'm going to look at. Win the War is another obvious reference to World War I. Isle of Wight's name in this race appears to be a pun on the word white in his sire's name of White Eagle, along with his dam of Sweet Waters. Spike Island won the 1922 Irish 2000 Guineas and Irish Derby, and Alaric will be named after first king of Visigoths, who sacked Rome in 410 AD. Pondland won this race and were named after an area in South Africa now known as Imapondweni, especially due to the Joel family connections with that country. It was owned by Sol Joel, and again a link in the Wikipedia article. His nephew Jim Joel was one of the very few people to own a winner of the Epsom Derby and the Grand National. Not to hasten to say the same horse. Pondland was trained by Etienne George Mestre, despite his name was born in New South Wales, Australia, and the son of a famous trainer. He was a private trainer for Sol Joel, and Pondland was ridden by Bernard Carslake, and again here is a card to have with his photo. Quentin Docupedia was born in Australia and living in Austria when World War I broke out. He ended up in Imperial Russia in 1916, where he was champion jockey for that year. After the Russian Revolution, he ended up in Britain, where he won all the classics bar the Derby. 1921 Pondland was busy and successful in his first season on the flat, winning 10 times with 5 wins. He made his debut at Newmarket Road in Mile on the 12th of May, was unplaced, and in June he won Newbury's Berkshire Foal Stakes 11 to 10 favourite. The Sheffield Daily Telegraph and also the Yorkshire Post fancied him for the race. Afterwards, the Western Mail felt he'd improved considerably since his debut, and the Yorkshire Post said he'd won in a canter. 6 days later he won the 5 furlong Coventry Stakes at Royal Ascot, won in hard ground as 5 to 4 favourite. That race is still a major two-year race early in the season, 100 years later, with impressive Roll of Honour, although it's now won over 6 furlongs. The Belfast Telegraph, London Daily News and the Yorkshire Post had tipped him for that race. Staffordshire Senator said he was a very useful 2-year-old. The Leeds Mercury and also Western Morning News wrote he won cleverly. Daily Herald made a similar comment over didn't tip him for a simple reason. They felt he wasn't going to run, and Soldier would run Polyhisto instead, and saying before, it still took 40 years for all that declarances to come in and solve this stupidity. Drake's Drum finished second, and a more well-known horse of that name won for Paul McCartney's dad on Grand National Day at Aintree in 1966, and I mentioned that horse in a future video I have about that Grand National card. The Daily Mirror thought the best 2-year-old seen so far was either Pondland or Lembach, and the Leicester Evening Mail felt Pondland was the best. A rugby advertiser felt he's the only really good 2-year-old to run at the Royal Meeting in Ascot. Pondland was then third of 5 runners in July Stakes, won at Newmarket July Course in June. Despite its name, July Course actually has flat racing all through June, July and August. Hull Daily Mail, Sunday Post, Parma Gazette and Belfast Telegraph tipped him. However, Belfast Telegraph felt he might not run on the hard ground, and Fortunatus in the Sheffield Daily Telegraph said he hadn't been seen at exercise and said to be doubtful runner. After the race, they said he had been reported overnight that Pondland had been a mist, and people were surprised to see him run. They thought after finishing moderate third, something must be wrong with him. The Daily Mail also saying he's turned up unexpectedly. Yorkshire Post said he moved to post most gingerly, and the bystander felt he shouldn't have run at all, as we'd been told that the Pondland had done little work since Ascot. However, the Sporting Chronicle correspondent wrote the exact opposite, saying he showed no signs of being missed before after the race. What appears to be a different correspondent of the same paper said he looked narrower before the race, didn't stay, and may have been affected by something affecting the Newmarket stables. A few days later, someone in the same paper felt he hadn't moved well to post. Actually, well, in July now, he was second in a match race at Glorious Goodwood. Sporting Chronicle fancied him due to have been winning on the gallops. Pondland led most of the way before losing by half a length. Sporting Times felt the hard ground issue of Pondland's defeat, and one of them being not as good as thought, or maybe not staying the 6 furlong trip which he faces in his last 2 races. The interesting Sporting and Racing News said it wasn't obvious who was the best 2-year-old as they've been beating each other. He returned a winning ways at Leicester over 5 furlongs when winning a 7-4 on favourite. Part of the Sporting Chronicle of the Sheffield Daily Telegraph felt he trained well since Goodwood. At least 9 papers praised his performance. Senator for the whole Daily Mail in October thought he might win the day before he actually won at Kempton Park I'm looking at today. Also wrote it the first time he'd won over 6 furlongs. I don't know if he'd been for cooking his sherry, but he must clearly already won over 6 furlongs 2 times beforehand. Podland then won over Con looking at the Kempton, and saying the next day by half a length. Star Greenan had felt he was run up at the lighter weight horses in this nursery handicap. Yorkshire Post and also Sporting Chronicle also preferred a different horse. Yorkshire Post, after felt the handicapper had made a serious mistake with the weight given to Ponderland, and clearly should have been the top of the handicap. Along with Sheffield Daily Telegraph and the Birmingham Daily Gazette, all 3 papers said the only money was for Ponderland in the race, and he's back down to 5-4 favourite. There's possibility for Middle Park Plate, now called Middle Park Stakes, but he didn't win. There's also possibility for the Suffolk Nursery Plate at Newmarket Rolling Mile. Sporting Chronicle felt the uphill run-in would be against him, when it was mentioned as probably missing the down nursery handicap just winning under a penalty. Later in the month, the Sheffield Daily Telegraph, very impressed by 5 furlong gallop he put in. He was second in 3 handicap at Newmarket Rolling Mile by 2 lengths, not to be mistaken with the April Classic trial at the course, which had placed that race from 1929. The Yorkshire Post Leeds Mercury selected him. The winner was called a Combination Colt. That wasn't his name, but as I said in the Salisbury video, horses could run without an official name, but you couldn't do now. That Pacific horse had finished second 2 days earlier. Then she was named Collaborator and with a Craven in 1922. Sheffield Daily Telegraph wrote Ponderland pounded as the headline. In November, Ponderland won a nursery at Aintree by a neck, with most people fancying a number of different horses in the race. The Era and also Sunday Post wrote Tip Ponderland. After the race, the Birmingham Daily Gazette liked him. The London Daily News felt they didn't know whether it was be a good 3-year-old, but that Joe should be part of his 2-year-old form. Western Daily News felt it was a fine performance as giving the winner up, who was £9. That winner up had been unbeaten. Daily Herald said it was a good victory over a good field. The Sporting Chronicle said it was a fine performance and it was a beautifully proportioned colt. The Leeds Mercury was similarly impressed. The Daily Mirror felt the after effects of a coffin fit that effect of a stable running up might have made a difference. Over the Sunday Mirror felt Ponda put in a smashing display. The Sporting Chronicle carried an advert from a Mr. Butler, who stated in large text 6 times he'd said Pondland was a certainty, and large text 4 times it was 4-1. Basically put your money on for him as well as yourself. Exactly the way these honest people operate now. And I'm certain these nice and kind honest people wouldn't give a different horse to each person as a tip. Later in November, Pondland was second at Hurst Park, beaten by another Sol Joel's horse, Sicyon. Some papers felt they both wouldn't won. Sicyon had been mentioned a number of times at Ponderland, and it looks like they've been kept apart until now. Newspaper opinions were split on who was most likely winner. Race appears to have been strange, with Sicyon apparently the main horse from Demestra and Joel in the race. Parmar Gazette wrote that Pondland was pulling double in the race. If you don't know what that means, it meant he was cruising. Sicyon though won, and the paper wrote Mr. Sol Joel decided to win with Sicyon. The papers wrote elsewhere that Carslake, who was on Sicyon, timed his run well. The Sunday Mirror said that Gardner on board Pondland was an easy, that was no sign of Sicyon. London Daily News wrote that Sol Joel had made it clear Sicyon would be the first of the 2 horses in the race, no matter what happened. Although the paper did have the subheading, Did Sicyon win big event on his merits? It said Gardner was the lead when Sicyon came through. Yorkshire Evening Post, Belfast Newsletter, the Sporting Chronicle and Western Mail also wondered whether the best horse had won. The former paper feeling that Pondland may now need a more severe 6 furlong horse. Daily Mirror wrote that many people felt Pondland would have beaten Sicyon of one of their merits, but they disagreed. Borden Times wanted to rule scrapped, which allowed Connection to say which of the horses would finish first. I felt it ended up with public opinion wanting combined odds on horses with the same connections, which the last I knew was how the French tote known as Paris Mutual operates today. Later the same paper wrote that the rule didn't help horses or the breeding industry if the best horse didn't win. Westminster Gazette for the Pondland State his balance was ideal for Epsom's Derby. The Daily Herald said he was better to stay. Newcastle Daily Chronicle expected Pondland to be a better freehold than Sicyon, and the latter's forte was speed. Sheffield Daily Telegraph and the Scotsman felt it wasn't clear which of the season's 2-year-olds were the best. The latter paper said they hadn't heard of a single bet so far been made on next year's Derby. They were rightly or wrongly they were going for Ponderland. However, Illustrating Sport and Dramatic News didn't fancy any of the sold Joel's horses for Derby. A Sport Chronicle journalist wrote a fellow contributor to a paper called Mercato come with a biometrical system for stamina of horses. He said Mercato felt Ponderland's best distance would be 9 furlongs. I wonder if it's sort of like the old dosage system, which is something that comes into vogue every so often in the last few decades. Anyway, he also mentioned that 3 of the 4 grandparents of Ponderland were descendants of the mare Distant Shore. Carbon writing bystander said his bookmaker friend had Pondland as an 8-1 favourite for the Derby. He also felt Joel had made a mistake by declaring Sicyon to win at Hurst Park, especially if that horse wasn't entered for any of the classics. Carbon felt that Pondland was too short a price at 8-1 for the Derby. Sporting Times on New Year's Eve felt there's no way he'd save a Derby trip. The same day Illustrated and Sporting Dramatic News preferred him for the Derby, but not strongly. 1922, February the 27th, the Scotsman said he was a current second favourite for the Epsom Derby at 8 and 9-1, and they felt he was the most likely winner, a view they repeated in March the 27th. On March the 13th, Western Mail said the Derby was very open, but Ponderland had wintered well, where they felt Ponderland would win the race. In early April, the Daily Mirror and also bystander fancied him to win at Newmarket Rolling Mile, but he didn't run. Western Mail felt that Ponderland was now the best of Joel's horses, but his favourite domestic 2-year-olds may not turn out to be as good 3-year-olds. Sheffield Daily Telegraph felt that Pondland was a crack 3-year-old. Pall Gazette said Pondland and Lembach were winter's fancies for the Derby, but they appeared less certain now. The Weekly Dispatch also felt Pondland was Joel's best horse. Sunday Mirror felt he was the best Newmarket trained chance for 2,000 guineas. The Belfast Newsletter said they weren't keen on betting on the guineas, but if they did, they'd back Ponderland. Dundee Courier was positive that Ponderland was Joel's best Derby candidate, but admitted he had yet to run this year. On April 10th, the Leeds Mercury and Sheffield Daily Telegraph said Ponderland was new Derby favourite. Western did point out that Sir Joel hadn't put a sovereign on Ponderland winning the Derby. The Dundee Courier said that this put them off backing him, and it should put the public off until Joel did back the horse. Dorfman and Whig wrote that Ponderland was commanding recently on the gallops, a view backed up by the Yorkshire Post. However, at the end of the week, the Daily Mirror said in a gallop he'd only finished third. This horse made the Sunday Mirror field against a horse for the guineas. Northern Whig felt that both the guineas and the Derby were open. The Western Morning News suggested he'd be better than guineas than in his recent gallops. Pall Gazette said too much was being taken on that trial, as did the Northern Whig and the Sheffield Daily Telegraph a little later. However, shortly afterwards, the latter paper felt it would be a month before he would be seen at his best. A few days later, the Yorkshire Post was greatly impressed by one of his gallops. The Newcastle Daily Chronicle, Belfast Newsletter and Leeds Mercury tipped him to win the guineas, with the latter making him their nap. Pondland was another winner of this Kempton card to look at today to be placed in the 2,000 guineas. Paragon had been third in the 1920 renewal, and in April Pondland was second in the 1922 renewal as 5-1 second favourite, beaten by St Louis. He was beaten by 3 lengths. The Daily Mirror felt he didn't stay. The Staffordshire Seneschal said there was very little delay and the race started 12 minutes late. If this happened now, there'd be heart attacks for the Rolling Mile executives and the TV coverage directors. St Louis, who won the Guineas, had only run once the year before and been unplaced. These days that's not impossible for a horse who didn't win as a 2-year-old to win the Derby, for example. Commander-in-Chief and Ruler of the World didn't run as a 2-year-old, and Harzand was 5th as a 2-year-old. However, it's inconceivable for the Guineas. Looking at this a while ago, the last 200 Guineas winner not to win as a 2-year-old was back in 1965. After Ponderland's win, the Western Mail and the Dundee Courier felt he was one of 4 horses they fancied of the Derby. The Sheffield Daily Telegraph correspondent said he was a favourite horse of theirs, and they also praised the recent gallop. The Northern Whig felt he didn't ever show anything on the gallops, just on the track. The Boxing World and Mirror of Life felt nothing that finished behind St Louis McGuinness, obviously including Ponderland, would beat him in the Derby, However, the Scotsman felt Pondland would reverse the form for McGuinness in the Derby. The Dundee Courier pointed out McGuinness' fourth South Crofty had shown next time that he didn't stay a yard over a mile, which made McGuinness form suspect at the Derby trial. They, along with the Sunday Post and Belfast Newsletter, felt if Pondland ran in the 1 mile 2 furlong Newmarket Stakes, they gave a strong idea whether he stayed. The Northern Whig and London Daily News fancied him to win that race. The Birmingham Daily Gazette said on the day that rumours the day before he was a non-runner were wrong. The current Newmarket Stakes is technically a different race as the older race was discontinued, but seems pretty much identical. Pondland returned in May, winning the Newmarket Stakes as even favourite. Yorkshire Post and Nottingham Journal were impressed by his win. However, at least 8 papers wrote he won easily, but it was a poor field. Despite the earlier view, the Belfast Newsletter felt the race didn't show whether he stayed, mainly because it was a poor field, and a good horse, they said, can stay any distance depending on the pace. The Sunday Mirror felt the same. However, at least 6 papers wrote the exact opposite and felt it showed he stayed. The London Weekly Dispatch felt he'd be a better horse in the autumn. There was widespread agreement in the papers that Ponderland preferred hard ground and the soft ground of McGuinness was against him. That, plus the papers reporting encouraging gallops, made him later in May become joint favourite and an outright favourite for the Derby. The Leeds Mercury found the situation confusing. Illustrated Sporting and Dramatic News had doubts whether St Louis would be inconvenienced that much by faster ground. The Nottingham Journal felt the only way Pondland could beat St Louis was if the ground had been reissued McGuinness. The Sunday Post felt Pondland was unfit and listless in McGuinness and would reverse that form of St Louis in the Derby. The Pall Mall Gazette wrote similar words. Yorkshire Post felt that whatever beat Pondland would win the Derby. The Daily Mirror felt Pondland would start shorter than 3-1 for the Derby. The Northern Whig pointed out that if Pondland had lost to Newmarket Stakes, St Louis' price for the Derby would have drifted, but St Louis' price hadn't shortened after Pondland won. The London Daily News wrote there was a fuss of rain of run up to the Derby and that could harm Pondland's chances. The Daily Herald came out strongly for Pondland, feeling it was useless to find a horse to beat him in the Derby. A journalist of the same article in a few different papers felt both Pondland and St Louis were ridiculously short prices of the Derby. The Dundee Courier thought Pondland would win. The Dundee Evening Telegraph thought the person who drew Pondland in the London Stock Exchange Derby had sold half his interest for £1,000 after buying a £1 ticket. That's of course £1,000 in 1922 prices. Westminster Gazette and the Dundee Evening Telegraph reported that Soul Joel was extremely confident of a victory. Then in May the 26th came a sensation. Gloucester Echo reported the Evening Standard quoting Soul Joel as saying Pondland trotted that morning and he'd been in full training work the next day. Joel was responding to newspaper reports earlier that day that Pondland was lame. The Dundee Evening Telegraph said Pondland had drifted to 5-1 for the Derby the following Wednesday, but no one was backing him, giving the concerns. He then drifted further over the next day or two, indeed as much as 10-1, so the confidence of Joel brought him back to 6-1 and later 9-2. From then up to the morning of the race, there was an avalanche of newspaper articles on well-being or not of Ponderland. The Pall Mall Gazette reported with Press Association saying it was a boil and it should be okay by the Derby. The newspapers reported it wasn't a serious issue and there was a light work a day or two later of over some bandages. Hull Daily Mail felt the concerns of making a mountain out of a molehill. Meanwhile, the Western Morning News felt a mere boil had created a greater sensation than a bomb or an earthquake. The Daily Herald wrote as they expected the story was exaggerated. The Yorkshire Post wrote it was a storm in a teacup. Middle of this there was an amusing story from Arthur Fraser in the Sunday Post about his housemaid dreaming of the win of the Derby. He wrote she dreamt a different horse every night in the middle of April. The year before she dreamt that Sean Spadar won by 10 lengths, but he pointed out to her that the Derby was a race of 3-year-olds and not one over fences, so a dream that a humorist fell at water jump was not wholly to be relied upon. The Sunday Post felt the person who sold their house share in Pondland for £1,000 must be congratulating himself. The John Bull and Dundee Courier liked him for the Derby. The Yorkshire Evening Post preferred St Louis. The Western Evening Herald wrote the Pondland injury situation was a mystery that deepened every hour. It was said he had recovered from his injury, but the bookmakers were uncommonly eager to accommodate people backing him. Then the day before the Derby, Pondland drifted back out to 13-2, while there were some rumours that now St Louis, the favourite, may not run. The Pall Mall Gazette said they met someone who was worried about a little war over this wretched Pondoland. They realised they meant the place in South Africa. The headlines such as trouble over Pondland would cause some anxiety. Then on Derby morning, the Yorkshire Post reported that Ponderland had been back the evening before to win the race, despite some alarming rumours about his health. The Leeds Mercury wrote there was a rumour at Epsom the day before that Ponderland was a non-runner, but this had surprised Demestre himself. The Dundee Evening Telegraph wrote that Ponderland had been dropped like a hot cinder in the betting. The Leeds Mercury wrote the correspondent telegraphed them the evening before, saying he couldn't win. The Tatler also didn't fancy him. The Nottingham Journal wrote they'd never liked him. The Daily Herald and Dundee Courier thought he would win as long as the rumour was false. The Daily Mirror wrote the Stock Exchange liked Ponderland, writing it was referred to as a Zionist. Fair enough. The Westminster Gazette was concerned about rumours. In the end, the Pall Mall Gazette subheading told the story of the Derby, sorry displayed by Ponderland. They wrote the race started 20 minutes late, largely due to horses breaking the tape, and felt the injury must have affected him. Westminster Gazette subheading was Inglorious Ponderland, 9th. He had been the 11-2 second favourite. The Daily Mirror wrote that Ponderland remained a mystery horse right to the end. Belfast Newsletter said there had been a rumour in the morning that Ponderland was dead. A few papers said something similar, so it's possible it's even actually literal. The Suffolk Daily Telegraph wrote he looked fine on paddock before the race, and other papers wrote the same. Ponderland's defeat didn't help Hoasley Bottomley, who the Exeter Plymouth Gazette wrote was amidst of an appeal and having heavily backed the horse during the Derby. Boxing World and Mirror of Life wrote that Soldier was showing a special film of the Derby in an interval at the Palace Theatre on the day of the race. They said he'd been wanting to watch Ponderland win twice on one day and booked 2 boxes. It's the only reference to the story, so I do wonder if it's true. Next month, John Bull wrote that Joel had been badly advised to run the horse after the injury. A more bizarre story is alleged in that the Derby winner Captain Cuttle had been slightly lame a week before and injected with cocaine. This is stated in Dublin Sport, with the Dundee Evening Telegraph saying it would be less than dentists were using human beings' gums. The Belfast Telegraph said the story was also in the Daily Express. The Daily Herald felt the story was absurd and spoke to an eminent vet who also said it was absurd. Lord Wolverton, the horse's breeder and owner, sued the Express for libel, but cannot find out the result. Ponderland won 4 more times that season, but surprisingly, won second place was the only time he was actually placed. Wikipedia article on St Louis says John Randall and Tony Morris rate him a poor 2,000 guineas winner, so it's maybe that Ponderland was less good than he appeared. The June he won at Royal Ascot isn't a surprise. However, that he won in the Royal Hunt Cup of the meeting is rather unexpected. The affair, quite a few horses were ahead of him in the handicap, so maybe it wasn't insane. Daily Herald did write he was surprised he won. But a couple of articles in the papers for the Derby about him possibly winning the Hunt Cup. Also, a bystander felt Ponderland would live to see a better day and injury affected him in the Derby. Portsmouth Evening News also felt he wasn't his best in the Derby. Western Mail and the Belfast Newsletter fancied him each way in the Hunt Cup. Letter also wrote that the form of him in the Derby was all wrong. The Belfast Telegraph said the same thing. Pall Mall Gazette wrote that Demestre felt he would atone for his Derby failure. Western Morning News said he had a strong chance and was again stated he was better on the track than the gallops. The Leeds Mercury strongly fancied him. The Daily Mirror didn't fancy him as he was a 3-year-old. I don't know the last 3-year-old to win the race in current times, but if Wikipedia is correct, it's before 1980. And he came 15th on the hard ground. The Yorkshire Post wrote that he filled up the hill. Westminster Gazette said he moved to post snatchily. The possibility one of the Stewards' Cup at Glorious couldn't go over 6 furlongs, which frankly just appears odd, only just after winning the Derby. The Belfast Newsletter stating he should be severely left alone for betting purposes as there's something wrong with him. And the Sunday Post felt he ran well in the Hunt Cup for a while, and looks like Joe felt he wasn't up to classic standard. Bluntly wrote a lot of other people realised that after the Derby. They felt he should be up to winning handicaps, and winning at Goodwood wasn't impossible. The Scotsman felt he won a good race. It was also possible for Midsummer Stakes Newmarket July course. The star Greenan wrote that his failing the Hunt Cup had not decreased his handicap mark, a complaint I suspect owners and trainers have been making forever. However, Northern Whig felt he wasn't hardly treated for the Stewards' Cup. Western Mail felt the same, but couldn't understand them at the moment. The Sunday Post felt that if Ponderland wasn't a classic standard, then he had too much weight in the Stewards' Cup. The Dublin Sport mentioned him as a possibility for the Cambridgeshire at Newmarket Rolling Mile. Pall Mall Gazette stated the class in the Durham County produce place at Stockton Bar, Ponderland and Craignawer wasn't high. Illustrated Sporting and Dramatic News gave the surely unexpected news that Ponderland wouldn't win in the St Leger. Belfast Newsletter felt that Sicyon was a much better horse than Ponderland over Cambridgeshire distance. The Northern Whig felt Ponderland may win in the Duke of York Stakes on today's card, but now of course in 1922. Pall Mall Gazette and Westminster Gazette wrote that if he turned up at Kempton, he'd have a very good chance of winning. It was similar to Clarence's along with Lady Sleeper, who I'll come to later. The Dundee Courier also liked Pondland's chances in the Champion Stakes. Palmer Gazette wasn't overly impressed by a gallop by Pondland in early October. Palmer Gazette also said him and Sickion had a very good chance at Cambridgeshire, and later the same paper pointed out he'd been second of a course in the Guineas. The Era agreed, or stated his win of the Newmarket Stakes was important. The New London Daily News wrote that Evander, who had been purchased by Joe to lead Sickion and Pondland in the work, proved too good for him in the trial, and Pondland was tailed off. The Sunday Illustrator felt this showed Pondland and Sickion to be overrated. The Yorkshire Post wrote that Pondland was under whip after only 5 furlongs. The Sunday Daily Telegraph believed though a later trial had some horse watchers feeling Pondland ran better, although he still preferred the form of the earlier trial. The Dundee Evening Telegraph said that Frank Bullock riding Pondland with Cambridgeshire would mean he would get more bets on the horse. Westminster Gazette stated there were flattering reports about Pondland. When failed in a handicap in the Hunt Cup, eventually his next run was indeed in the Cambridgeshire. Another handicap, this time back at Newmarket Rolling Mile. He wasn't in the top 12 home. This was a Derby second favourite, who now 2 runs later was starting at 50-1. The Yorkshire Post wrote they'd be surprised if Pondland didn't win a race for the rest of the season. However, the Illustrated and Sporting and Dramatic News stated he was no use about him after his Cambridgeshire race, stating he'd only won 1 of his last 5 races, and that was the Even's favourite member of the Newmarket Stakes, being his only win. He went back to 1.5 miles in Liverpool St Leger, won at Aintree in November. The Sheffield Daily Telegraph wrote he won there as a juvenile but might not win now. The Birmingham Daily Gazette said that he was an unreliable sort. The Northern Whig felt the race was open and he was a better class than his opponents he might win. Daily Mirror tipped him to win. In the end he was second at 9-4, beaten 1.5 lengths. Scotsman and Belfast Newsletter felt for £9 Pondland was given the winner settled the issue. The Leeds Mercury bluntly wrote, one-time Derby favourite, Pondland cut out an inglorious figure in the St Leger. That's of course not the Doncaster St Leger he didn't run in, but there's a few St Legers at the time, not more than they are nowadays. They said he didn't get 1.5 miles. The Pall Mall Gazette were brutal. They said Pondland's second was too late for him for the old Manchester Racecourse's November handicap, as all of Joel's horses had been withdrawn. That race is now won at Doncaster after Manchester closed. They said Sickion is dead meat, and Pondland was a ghost to his former self, and Joel had a very poor season. Pondland ended his season when placed 1 at Hurst Park. Later the Pall Mall Gazette again didn't hold back in their criticism, saying Eaglehawk being beaten by Pondland in a gallop didn't say much for the former horse, as Pondland had been a hopeless course this season. John Bull gave him some support for Lincolnshire Handicap, then ran at the old Lincoln racecourse rather than Doncaster. For many decades through the 20th century, that race was talked about months in advance. The Yorkshire Post was surprised given the last flat season that anti-post waging would have any attraction, and so many punters now would share that sentiment, myself included. They said there's already a whisper for Pondland and Lincolnshire. The Leicester Evening Mail shared that view about the race. The Belfast Newsletter felt as a class horse that comes to hand early and should have a chance of a race. The Pall Mall Gazette wrote, I'd not supposed Mr. Joel, his excellent trainer Demestra, has the foggiest idea where Pondland would be standing on 3 or 4 legs 3 months hence. The Daily Herald wrote in early January that the Lincolnshire was a favourite race of Joel's. Reynolds' newspaper wrote that Pondland, having been entered for the race, owed them and thousands of other people a lot of money, writing his form since the Guineas was one of the most inexplicable things of the previous season. The Belfast Newsletter wrote that Pondland was one of the best of class at 2-year-old and showed it again last season on 1 or 2 occasions. They said he went wrong physically and possibly nervously, but now seemed all right. Wrote he seemed most likely winner as the distance and the Lincoln racecourse would suit him admirably. The Pall Mall Gazette was glad he was entered for the race, and he proved to be a spring horse the previous season. Newcastle Daily Chronicle tipped him for the race. Western Mail felt as well in on 8 stone £5, a view shared by the Rugby Advertiser. However, Dundee Courier felt he was not a certain runner. Indeed, on January 31st, the Pell's anti-post betting was shown as Pondland, along with 2 other fancied horses, taken out of a Lincolnshire handicap, and what was generally seen as a surprise. Nottingham Evening Post and the Nottingham Journal wrote a severe blow to many early backers, and the London Daily News wrote about burnt fingers. The Western Mail wrote Pondland remained in Victoria Cup at Hurst Park and the Jubilee Handicap at Kempton. Fortunatus in the Star Greenan wrote a remarkably idiosyncratic article partly based on Pondland's absence, wrote a number of a racing fraternity had got it into the head that Pondland had been laid away in lavender, as they used to say when they were young, for the Lincolnshire. Accordingly, these people backed him. Leading away in lavender appears to have meant keeping something in drawers of lavender in it rather than using it for dresses, so basically I assume he means his Bacchus photo has just been kept from the waist and just fresh and hoping it would run well. The next phrase Fortunatus used is even more tricky. He said that those Bacchus couldn't believe Job would decline such a golden opportunity of despoiling the Egyptians. The phrase despoiled the Egyptians comes from the Exodus chapter in the Bible and looks like it meant the Hebrew God was removing spoiling and redeeming the Egyptians. Therefore, Fortunatus may have meant those Bacchus thought to win would redeem Pondland's career, especially in the eyes of Joel and Demestra. The Sunday Mirror said that although Pondland's absence of the race was generally seen, they had a better chance in the Victoria Cup, they showed it still showing that Demestra was finding him difficult to train. The Dublin Evening Telegraph wrote in late March they wanted to see Pondland return to a toured form before supporting him again. The London Daily News felt a 1 mile gallop showed him travelling smoothly and was getting passed back into his form from the previous spring. Pondland's stamina was called in question by the Pall Mall Gazette, who were not surprised he was intended when in the Newbury Spring Cup rather than Epsom's City and Suburban Handicap over a couple of furlongs longer. Although I felt the severity of the two races was similar, as Epsom tends to be an easier course, so to speak, than Newbury. They actually also fancied him for the Spring Cup. The Yorkshire Post voted substantially improved and would distinguish himself in handicaps throughout the season. A few days later, Manchester Evening News reported a press association as saying that Pondland was restricted to cantering exercise. In a repeat of the situation of the Derby the year before, over the couple of days, people were reported he might have gone lame and not won in the Spring Cup. However, the following day, the Sheffield Daily Telegraph reported he seemed fine when galloped over 6 furlongs. The Scotsman agreed, but said he wouldn't be too much trust in him until he found some way of wiping away his poor performance in the previous season. Halifax Evening Courier wrote he might not win the Spring Cup as invaluable other possible races, and he also may have gone wrong. People wrote that had seen 2 gallops him that week and thought he was well for Newbury. Of the same edition, Larry Links wrote he'd been warned to keep off Pondland for the race. Westminster Gazette thought he'd do better later in the season, and a few days later wrote he'd need to come back into form before the public trusted him. The Era agreed it was early for him in the season, although thought he was a pick of the handicap. A Nottingham Evening Post understood him to be very well. Yorkshire Post wrote he'd been rather disappointing last season and been going very well in his recent gallops and tipped him for the race. Leeds Mercury felt he wouldn't need to be at his best to win the race given his relatively lightweight. However, Western Post thought he still wasn't at his best. The end Pondland was, according to the Leeds Mercury, a last-minute non-winner for a Spring Cup, but they felt it was because of a soft ground. The Jelly Herald felt this a surprise, also felt it was too to the ground of view, but backed up by Kilda Observer. A Dundee Courier couldn't understand Mester's training methods. Hartlepool Northern Daily Mail felt Pondland was a good horse to be following. The Sheffield Daily Telegraph felt he was likely to win the Victoria Cup and was very impressed by recent gallop. Reynolds' newspaper also liked him. However, Illustrated Sporting and Matic News didn't fancy him. In the end, his next race was a Newbury handicap at Kempton. Western Mail stated that Joel felt Pondland's problems due to a heel injury, and at one time it was felt he could lose his foot. The paper felt he's okay now. This appears to be the first time this specific issue of the heel was actually mentioned, rather than just some boils or anything like that. It reminds me of a line the Racing Post analysis used about the 1998 Champion Chase, when Ask Tom, the favourite, was very disappointing. They said his trainer Tom Tate had not let on, but Ask Tom had suffered an injury in the run-up, and failing to let on had done punters a great disservice. Greg Wood, writing in The Independent, was pretty brutal in his criticism. Going back to Jubilee Handicap, the Era felt Pondland was the best horse if he showed a flatter shot of his old form. Several Daily Telegraph liked him for the race. London Daily News felt his recent gallops were the best he'd shown so far this year. The Pall Mall Gazette wrote Pondland had been whispered for the race and represented classic form, and Pondland moved to joint favourite. The Leeds Mercury felt his claims on form but weren't great, but someone must fancy him, as it's not clearly saying that someone's backing him. They're not, but someone must be. They also stated people wouldn't have seen him as obvious stayer. There must be some purpose in running him previously over longer distances. Manchester Evening News pointed out that he appears to expected to do well, but has been disappointing last season. Dobbs at times the Chesterfield Herald said he was favourite for last season's Derby and were told he's better horse this year than when he won the Newmarket Stakes 12 months ago and would win. Of course, he's actually second favourite of the Derby, although at some point anti-post favourite. The Leeds Mercury also mentioned he was expected to win the Derby, although lacking reform as some of his rivals. I said he was likely to start favourite, showed his return to health and power. The Daily Herald had a persistent tip for him and had been reportedly backed to win an enormous sum. They doubted this as they felt the market gets sensitive immediately if there is an inquiry for a live candidate, another current day issue there from 100 years ago. Though to be a consistent disappointment since finishing second in the Guineas. To be fair, Pondland did win the Newmarket Stakes, although it was an easy race. They agreed to start favourite but didn't favour his claims. The Western Mail thought the student of an if about Pondland, and he would win just about in his best field form. He must be taken on trust. In the Jubilee Handicap, Pondland continued where he left off from the previous season, sadly. The Yorkshire Post wrote he cracked under pressure. He finished in place at around 15-2. Sheffield Daily Telegraph wrote he'd grown to a nice coat of good size and quality, and Demestre had palpably given him a sound preparation. London News and Portsmouth Evening News felt he looked well. They said it was more likely him not staying rather than his condition stopping him from winning. The Scotsman wrote he was clear on the straight, but was first to come under pressure. Another article they felt Pondland could be considered for a Newmarket handicap on this form. Sheffield Daily Telegraph thought he might win in that race, and for Fortuna has in the same edition thought it unreasonable to run so soon after Kempton. Portsmouth Evening News felt he ran indifferently, but felt sure he would see a better day. The Daily Herald felt he had clearly come back to form and win a good handicap over Mar, possibly the World Hunt Cup. The Yorkshire Post and the Portsmouth Evening News felt the same. Manchester Evening News, Nottingham Evening Post and the Haslenden Gazette gave Pondland a strong chance for Kempton's Windsor Castle handicap over 7 furlongs. London News Daily wrote that Pondland was fancied in the north for the World Hunt Cup. Also, he was one of the most disappointing horses Joel had owned for some time. Robbie Advertiser felt 1 mile trip would suit him better than the 2 furlongs at Kempton. The Scotsman Daily Herald also liked him for the race. The Hull Daily Mail hoped to be for a straight course like Ascot's Hunt Cup course. The Sunday Post thought he wasn't overweighted on 8 stone 6 pounds. Palmer Gazette acknowledged he had a low weight based on his best form, but a great many backers were tired of waiting for him to show winning form, even if his owner and trainer were not tired of waiting. The Edinburgh Evening News wrote that Tom Pondland hadn't won since last May. Sunday Mirror felt he was probably start favourite. London Weekly Dispatch felt he didn't look like a hardy horse either due to stamina or temperament. One of his newspaper wondered whether he'd recovered from his trainer's juvenile career. Remember, he did win 10 times, and even if he'd won the Hunt Cup, he'd owe Joel a lot of money. I felt he was well handicapped to win if recovering any of his old form, and in the end they tipped him. Portsmouth Evening News, Dundee Courier, Derry Journal and the Sportsman also tipped him. The Leeds Mercury liked him and felt he'd been running too far at the end of the previous season. A Pall Mall Gazette correspondent who doesn't look like their normal correspondent did feel that Pondland had a lot to atone for, but tipped him for the race. Birmingham Daily Gazette wrote he'd been greatly fancied by his astute trainer. The Daily Mail wrote the Jubilee Handicap form had worked out well and was no doubt he'd be suited by the course and distance. As he also said he'd been a big disappointment since finishing second in the Guineas, and he generally paid disregard horses who need excuses for their failures. The Daily Mail felt he didn't really like a stout struggle. The Sheffield Daily Telegraph thought 1 mile trip would suit him better, but I felt he had not been moving so freely. On the day, the Dundee Courier listed the newspaper tips, with the Sporting Life solo along the Times 2 tipsters from the Sportsman all going for Ponderland. The lifespan of the spot felt he'd be placed. The Exeter and Plymouth Gazette also went for him to win. If he hadn't Pondland improved on his performance from the Hunt Cup from the year before, this time finishing 7th at 14-1. Westminster Gazette wrote he was never very conspicuous in the race, although the Daily Mirror and Leeds Mercury wrote he was nicely placed at halfway. The Sunday Mirror said he flattered to deceive and appeared to be without course or distance. The Yorkshire Post wrote for Joel was said to be so sure of victory to order the menu for a celebration of the event that night. As I said, this is probably facetious gossip. If you're plowing through this video, and well done if you have, or at least you go and see a psychiatrist, you'd remember that the story he'd allegedly hired someone to show a film of Derby the year before. I started to look up if there's any possible truth to what were now 2 stories of this type. A discussion posted about him on Reading Forum, a place where he had strong connections, said he was a flamboyant character. Reading Evening Post article from May 1995 describes him as a colourful character renowned for throwing extravagant parties. I suspect these stories go under the category if they aren't true they ought to be. Ponderland headed the weights for London Cup ran at the old London course at Alexander Park, but before long was moved from the race. Portsmouth Evening News felt to win a good handicap during the season. Hull Daily Mail felt he should be followed. However, Dublin Evening Telegraph wrote they'd given him up as hopeless under any ground or distance. Sunday Post found he ran well in the Jubilee and better than most people thought in the Hunt Cup. They said the easy 1 mile of the Linfield Park Stakes would suit him, as did the Manchester Evening News. The Yorkshire Post also liked him. Scotland felt 1 mile was as far as he cared to travel. Pacific Palmer Gazette journalists who seemed to like him, while the main journalist felt he could win if he did his best. The Dublin Evening Telegraph wrote that Joe seemed impregnable with his 2-year-olds, including Pondland, Packham War before him, but last year was a disappointment for him. Belfast Newsletter wrote Pondland had been doing well recently. The Sportsman felt he was nice handicap at the minute, but never seemed to get there, and felt there might be a soft spot some in the horse. The Derry Journal felt he wasn't as good as he was. The Sportsman wrote they were getting tired of him. and was yet to prove himself at 6 furlongs, which is a distance he might won in if he won in the July handicap at Newmarket July course. The John Bovo liked him for the race. Leicester Evening Mail liked him for the Stewards Cup if he won. Eventually, Pondland's next race after All Ascot was back at Hurst Park for 7 furlongs. Western Morning News liked him in the weight if he gave his true winning. However, the Scotsman after headline was Ponderland disappoints, and they wrote he'd lost all form. He was then placed as a 2-to-1 favourite. Dundee Courier simply writing he ran very badly. The Scotsman said he looked the least good in the paddock and refused to do anything when asked for an effort. Belfast Newsletter wrote he was never involved. This reminds me of a period in late 1999 where backed Escarta Fig a few times, thinking surely a horse of that quality was too high a price, only for him to keep being unplaced. Long afterwards, Pondland won in the Drayton handicap at Glorious Goodwood in early August, which he was top weight. Leeds Mercury thought his winning account was well overdue. The Birmingham Daily Gazette felt his recent form was not encouraging. The Manchester Evening News gave him a chance. The Sheffield Independent were change of tactics was tried, with him leading from the front, although he was beaten by a short head, obviously a significantly better performance. Nottingham Journal, Yorkshire Post and Sportsman and the Sheffield Daily Telegraph were all impressed by his run. He didn't win again that season, although some encouraging gallops reports from newspapers are mentioning him for some races, mainly the Norwich Handicap and the Cambridge, both at Newmarket Ordinary Mile, and the Duke of York Handicap on today's Kempton card. Star Greenan felt he wouldn't have the stamina for a Cambridgeshire, but Sportsman wrote he lost now 9 races in a row. There was a possibility for the London Cup at Alexander Park, and this appears to be a different London Cup at Alexander Park from one I mentioned earlier, although the Westminster Gazette wondered whether he'd be as effective as a circular track. Alexander Park being very famous for being a tight track and one of course, but Willie Carson once stated wanted bombing. The Star Greenan wrote that he couldn't tip him for the race given major doubts, but still feared him. But Dundee Courier felt he couldn't be trusted. In the end, he was nominated due to tragic circumstances. So Joe's son Wolf had died in an accident on the way to India a few days beforehand, and clearly he wasn't going to be running his horses in those circumstances. One consequence of Wolf Joe's death was that it gave another case for Tutankhamun's tomb, as it visited it the year before, while the chief archaeologist Howard Carter seemed to be totally unaffected by that supposed curse, what the pastor was promoting it by. I think that's any sort of conspiracy theory, it doesn't hold up to the facts. In early January 1924, the Dundee Courier wrote that Ponderland was a very promising 2-year-old but appeared to go off last year, and the Dublin Sport made similar comments. Sporting Times wrote that many people are going tired of waiting for Ponderland to come up again. They wrote that he was freely whispered for several races at the end of the season, but still hadn't won since Goodwood. However, he did at least run well at Goodwood. Edinburgh Evening News felt he had an undeniable chance at weight in the Lincolnshire Handicap. The Freeman Journal agreed. The Scotsman also agreed but was uncertain about him. The Leeds Mercury said he was a difficult animal to estimate but had a chance to race. Later, they felt he might won his other spring engagements. The London Daily News had a headline: Pondland could win the Lincoln if in the mood. The Western Mail and the Freeman's Journal thought the odds would shorten for the race for him, and the latter fancied him. The Leeds Mercury wrote he hadn't won for nearly 2 years, and Demestre clearly found him a difficult horse to train for Pacific races. However, thought he'd wintered well, and later on wrote he was fancied for a Lincolnshire. Dundee Courier felt he had a good chance for a race. Sporting Times felt he should be back to the day of the race, as Clee given Demestre training problems and may not run. The Sheffield Daily Telegraph had a similar view. Sportsman again thought the horse had a soft spot and was no great admirer of him. Yorkshire Post wrote he'd always finished out his races resolutely, what I find an odd comment given previous views about the horse, in fact most of all of the previous views really. The Rubber Advertiser liked him given his 2,000 guineas and Newmarket Stakes form, but they did write his courage was open to doubt, but of course the exact opposite of the Yorkshire Post view. There was a debate in the papers whether Evander or Ponderland would be Joe's horse in the race. There was a trial in which both were beaten, and this meant Ponderland went out to 50-1 to the Lincolnshire. Yorkshire Evening Post noted that Evander had been taken out of the Liverpool Cup, making it more likely he'd won at Lincoln and Pondland would win at Aintree. That's indeed what happened. Page said there had been a test gallop and Evander had beaten Pondland easily, so Pondland was moved to the Aintree race. Star Greenland wrote that Pondland's name must stink in the nostrils of many Lincoln speculators. Sportsmen wondered whether Pondland, who hadn't won in nearly 2 years, was any good anywhere as a trial horse. The Daily Herald and Hull Daily Mail fancied him for the Liverpool Cup, although the latter paper eventually went with another horse. Belfast Telegraph West and Mail thought his best distance may be shorter than that, around 2.5 furlongs here, although the Hull Daily Mail disagreed. The Westminster Gazette didn't fancy him top weight, feeling he was unreliable. But Sportsman was also against him if he hadn't won for 2 years, hadn't won this season, and probably wasn't sound. I was rather surprised, frankly, to find out he won here. And that is only because my copies of Rough Guides are a little unclear. They may all be, in fact, yet again, so I have to say. And he runs in race at 7 and race 48. And it looks like you can see here, it looks like race 7's been crossed out. And it was just, I think it was a bit of a printing blunder and someone's fiddled about with it a bit. Pondland was replaced yet again, this time winning at Aintree. Sunday Post correspondent felt he ran well, but Silverspur in the same paper felt he showed again his unreliability. But if and when he ever wins, he would carry none of their money. Yorkshire Post wrote he kept disappointing all concerned. The Scotsman felt he could end up being more fit though, and Domestic would not have despaired of winning a good race with him. For Nottingham Evening Post, and the Scotsman wrote he had lost a chance to be placed by winning wide into the straight. But for Dundee Crew and Westminster Gazette fancied him for Earl of Sefton's plate the next day, gaining the Aintree if he won, but he didn't. Western Morning News, Exeter Plymouth Gazette, Sportsman and the Sheffield Daily Telegraph mentioned for the Doveridge Handicap at Old Derby racecourse. That paper felt Domestic's methods of frequently crowned with success, but occasionally sounded somewhat peculiar. However, Westminster Gazette didn't like him for that Derby race. Looks a different correspondent in the same paper said he'd be dangerous in that race, but he was not to be relied upon. The Birmingham Daily Gazette said they support Pondland if the ground is softer. This is opposite to earlier views. He wanted fast ground. The Daily Herald felt was a good race in him still, and remembered his 2-year-old form, and mentioned he was a sound horse, exact opposite of the earlier view of the Sportsman. The Truth felt he would do better later on. In the end, Pondland won the Newbury Spring Cup instead of at Derby. Western Morning News liked him for the race, as did the Halifax Evening Courier, the People, Hull Daily Mail, Yorkshire Post, Daily Herald, London Daily News, Sheffield Daily Telegraph, Birmingham Gazette, and the Belfast Newsletter. The last paper went as far as making their nap. Western Evening Herald supported him each way. A different London Daily News correspondent liked his recent galloping. Western Mail said he was well handicapped, but he was always going to win a race, but then never did. And they said they would give him one last chance. The Sportsman liked him, but felt he was swept off steam when asked for an effort close home. Another journalist for that paper wrote that though the preview said he wouldn't win another race, he was looking and moving well, and they quietly hoped that they'd prove him wrong. Daily Mail felt that if he reproduced his first mile form from the Liverpool Cup, few if any would beat him. He added Pondland had his own days of racing and was not to be trusted these days. Liverpool gave the result writing. All the big noises about Pondland and all the others were down the field, including all of those tips, of course, from all the journalists. And he was then placed as a 4-1 favourite, for he had actually drifted in the market on the day. The People wrote he ran badly. Leeds Mercury wrote Pondland clearly carrying the unjustified trust of the people, never shaped like a fight. He'd spent his desire for racing at halfway. Western Mail journalists who wrote he would give him one more chance now stated they would actually leave him alone. Yorkshire Post wrote he kept disappointing Demestra. The Northern Whig wrote Pondland again disappointed his trainer, and indeed is a heartbreaking animal. It reminds me of a Racing Post analysis of the 1997 King George VI chase, which went, challenge your luck would drive you to tears. The Daily Herald wrote Pondland had lost his zest for racing. The Sporting Times mentioned him as one of 3 horses in the race that were well left alone. The Western Evening Herald wrote he ran disappointingly. Sheffield Daily Telegraph stated he was undependable. The John Paul newspaper gave daily tips in code in various newspapers. An example of that it gave to read for code was Ponderland. It was mentioned for an Epsom handicap, and the end next ran at Royal Ascot's Trial Stakes, nowadays called the Queen Anne Stakes in June, rather than the Royal Hunt Cup it ran in the previous 2 years. Western Morning News felt it had a chance in the race, as did the Leicester Evening Mail. The Sporting Times are queried whether he acted at Ascot. Silverspur in the Sunday Post wrote he had been a great disappointment with Joel, while a different correspondent in the same paper wrote he was always a horse who was going to win, but never did. Again, journalists in run-up liked his galloping. Nottingham Evening Post wrote he had become a disappointing animal to Joel relative to the public. Belfast Newsletter wrote he was fast becoming Backer's bugbear. Scottishman's subheading after the race was Pondland unreliable. He ended up being unplaced 7-2 second favourite. Yorkshire Post wrote he appeared to have lost all interest in racing, and Backer should hesitate about supporting him again. Western Mail wrote the disappointing Pondland was also well backed. The Nottingham Journal said Pondland is indeed a disappointing animal to his owner as well as trainer, and Feather John Bull wrote, I'm disgusted with Ponderland. If there was another race, it would probably be at Hawthorne Hill next winter. That did make me laugh. The now closed Hawthorne Hill was a pretty minus jump track. I've done 2 previous 100th anniversary race calendar videos. One was for 1920 Salisbury card, there will link here because, well, why not? More relevantly, the other was 1921 Hawthorne Hill card, and also link that here as too. In modern times, the journalist is basically saying, I suppose the top quality flat horses next win with novice hurdle at Plumpton, or more accurately, the currently closed Toaster. Edinburgh Evening News mentioned he was too unreliable for their liking. The Leeds Mercury felt he was deteriorating. Ponderland's next race was the Anniversary Cup at Sandown. The Yorkshire Post felt he won a good handicap, and the going, which was quick, would be in his favour. Again, the opposite of what a journalist wrote before. I wonder if the Cinema journalist's line of avoiding horses and the excuse of failures is coming true. The ground's too quick, the ground's too slow, etc. Birmingham Daily Gazette felt with Joe's horses in good form might be unwise not to back Pondland, as he was always going to do something all season. The Exeter and Plymouth Gazette chipped him. The Sportsman though felt he disliked uphill finishes. Belfast Telegraph called him an unlucky horse. Hull Daily News felt due fear to trust the horse of Star Green and called him ubiquitous but disappointing. Silver Daily Telegraph liked a gallop of his, but wrote he needed to be human to go well. Western Morning News felt he was one of the most difficult horses to assess in Newmarket, and they hesitated to trust him in public. After the race, a Staffordshire senator wrote that finally he actually won a race, to surprise the majority of the onlookers. He was 9-1. Carrying 8 stone 3 pounds as second top weight in the handicap in his first win in 26 months. To be fair, he's actually backed him level stakes. He just might make a profit since the Derby, well, at least towards level anyway. The race was over, this time, 1 mile and a quarter. The people wrote that most of his backers were tired of waiting to win. Belfast Newsletter had long discarded him as untrustworthy and still held to that view despite his win. Dundee Courier said the old friend had won, but did not know how many times they had previously backed and selected him, and did wonder some of the old friends a slightly sarcastic comment. They also said he had never seen him look so well before. The Sportsman wrote he caused Joe more disappointment than any other horse he had. He said he looked extremely well over paddock, but given his form it wasn't surprising the public hadn't backed him. Westminster Gazette wrote his win was a tragedy, those who had been consistently backing him since Derby 2 years ago and had given up on him. The Rugby Advertiser said they had tipped him for all sorts of races, and as he never lived up to his home reputation they had given up on him. The Northampton Chronicle and Echo called him uncertain. Illustrated Sporting and Dramatic News wrote he'd won after many failures. Different section of paper wrote they had to give him full credit for his win, and it was never too late to mend, but felt cockpit in the race had given too much to do. Ross Common Messenger perhaps summed it up best, writing, when most backers are absolutely fed up, Pondland wins the Anniversary Cup at Sandown and confounds us all. It's animals like Pondland that keep us poor. Illustrated Police News wrote that the stable had always liked him, he kept disappointing. This is the first time I quoted this paper. It did actually have a racing section. Now, the racing section is always a cartoon sketch or story which appeared never to have any text given the context. For this edition, it was Woman's Mad Dance Institute of Infinite Arms, and in the end I decided once to look at the rest of the paper, and the related story was 2 pages earlier. Ponderland incurred a £10 penalty for the 6th Furlong Stewards Cup, which was his next race at Glory School in July. Hull Daily Mail wrote he only had to repeat his Sandown form to win, and a good 6 furlong form as a 2-year-old. Western Mail wrote he was expected to win and was back in form even with his penalty. One of 2 horses tipped for a race by the Sheffield Daily Telegraph. Podden won a trial gallop for the Stewards Cup, of a Sportsman felt he didn't beat much. Daily Herald cautioned reading too much into a gallop, there's no certainty he would repeat even with his Sandown win. London Daily News felt there was good reasons to back him, but consistency was still an issue. Birmingham Gazette felt he was too inconsistent. Pondland ended up 3rd, 9-1 joint favourite. Sporting News mentioned he made a resolute challenge, and a few days later they said he just lacked speed. Daily Mirror felt the weight told on him. The Westminster Gazette felt he looked the beautiful horse he always was, and the next day wrote he probably won 2 days later in Drayton Handicap, which had been a close second the year before as top weight. The Sheffield Daily Telegraph thought he'd probably win the race, as did the Sportsman. The Sportsman also liked a gallop he did the day between the two races and felt his Tourist Cup may have freshened him up, and Pondland indeed won the 1 mile duration handicap as 5-1 favourite. Gain was carrying a £10 penalty for his Sandown win. Freeman's Journal said he was a better horse now than ever was, living up to his reputation. He was a jolly good horse. Westminster Gazette thought it was very meretricious and remarkable how he was able to having done nothing, as now coming right back to his best form. London Daily News had a headline of Ponderland, a reformed character. Western Morning News, the headline was Ponderland makes amends. They thought he proved he was better suited to a mile. Portsmouth Evening News said he appeared to be a reformed character, as did the London Sporting and Dramatic News. Latter paper said he'd been deceiving for over 2 years. Sponsor wrote they hadn't realised until after the race what an exceptionally fine, powerful horse he was. They written in the morning that a whiff of an opponent and anathema to him meant a whip, even when it was not used on him and rather used on one of his opponents. Yorkshire Post felt he was back to his best form. London Daily Dispatch thought it was the outstanding performance of the Goodwood meeting. The Wakefield Advertiser and Gazette thought he would return to form with a vengeance. Star Greenan said after extreme patience had worked with him over middle distances that notorious horse, as they called him, would be trying to the longer distances, and if he stayed he was favourably handicapped due to his class. Watson felt he wouldn't stay the 2 mile distance at Manchester, added the Sunday Post. When I was going through his races this year, I wondered whether they drew his distances out of a hat. That's Joel and Demetra. In succession, he has ran a mile and a quarter, 6 furlongs, 1 mile and 2 miles. The go-between, which is a novel by L.P. Hartley, starts with the phrase, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." The past things were different in 1924, but it still sounds crackers to do with the Ponderland, especially going up to 2 miles, and he's actually now winning races at much shorter. The John Bull felt he had a chance of just over a mile, but Cambridgeshire was too much of him. The Dublin Evening Telegraph thought he might be worth supporting at Manchester, as the connections had taken out a likely weighted stayer from the race in preference to him. The Rugby Advertiser stated that what he was generally regarded as a miler, he had improved his age, and he may be able to stay. The Sporting Times felt surprised he'd been entered for longer races. They thought he had very obvious Cambridgeshire possibilities, but his recent wins had left him more exposed in the handicap. The Sunday Mirror felt he would be satisfied as a stayer if they saw it in public. There were a number of Gallup's reports in the papers feeling he could stay, and was also helping the connections Polyphantis with its St Leger efforts, and that latter horse went on to finish third in the St Leger. Sportsman run up to Manchester said he was a great form, but doubted he could stay 2 miles, especially under a strong pace and holding ground. Westminster Gazette also said he could not be better, but doubted his stamina. Wesley Morning News said he was to be fancied, but his stamina needed to be taken on trust. Later on, they'd never been a favourite of theirs, and so didn't fancy him. Derbyshire Times and Chesterfield Herald and also Sunday Post opposed him again on stamina grounds. After the race, the Western Morning News wrote he never flattered, and I assume as in getting as far as flattering to deceive. Birmingham Daily Gazette wrote he made a poor show and he was last. The Sheffield Daily Telegraph wrote he finished last but once. I'm not quite sure where he finished, but nowhere near winning or even the places. The Leeds Mercury did wipe the surprise of race of Pondland, who was still there 3 furlongs from home, I'm guessing, not expecting to stay that long at all. A few days later he ran in the Doncaster Cup over 2 miles 1 furlong, and I wonder how many horses ran in the 6 furlong Stewart Cup and that 2 mile 1 furlong race in their careers, never mind the same season. Leicester Evening Mail felt he was better over a mile. Birmingham Daily Gazette felt he was a forlorn hope. Sportsman felt he was well in the weights, but again felt he wouldn't stay. After the race, the Staffordshire Senator wrote that although few thought he'd get that 2 mile 1 furlong trip, he was in second place and looked a likely winner until the end. The Sportsman agreed, and he ended up 4th of 6 winners at 10-1. The Leeds Mercury felt he shaped well for a long way. London Daily News thought his effort was short-lived. Sheffield Daily Telegraph, Yorkshire Post, the Birmingham Gazette and the Leicester Evening Mail tipped him for the Lingfield Autumn Handicap back over a mile the same month. The Leeds Mercury said it was his best distance, but he might not adapt after his long distance work, which would have included helping with St Leger horse as well as his 2 races over 2 miles and 2 miles 1 furlong. The Yorkshire Post also selected him for the Lingfield race. The Sporting Times though felt the course could be too sharp for him. The Dundee Courier wrote after the race that the training of his over long distances has slightly taken edge off his speed. Western Gazette wrote he gave a listless display, and they wrote he was well placed at 6 furlongs but then couldn't quicken. The Leeds Mercury Sporting Times agreed, and he wasn't placed. In October, ran a welter handicap at Newmarket Rolling Mile and came to handicap day. He was given £17 or more to all the horses over a 1 mile trip and finished 10th. He was in the entries for Flat Apprentice played at Adrian early in November, and I didn't run, but it's almost conceivable that a Guinea second and Derby second favourite even end up being considered for that sort of race. December 1924, Western Morning News wrote that Walter Earl had taken on from Demestra as private trainer to Sol Joel. It was stated that Pondland would remain in training for another year, and the paper felt Earl would be able to get a good race out of him. Later the same paper mentioned him for a Lincolnshire handicap yet again. He's been mentioned of that race. In late January 1925, the Sporting Times thought Ponderland gets you guessing a bit but had revived last year. Leeds Mercury wrote he wasn't one for quick preparation and wondered whether the real horse had been seen since the Derby, although he ran well at Goodwood last year. Daily Herald wrote that Wood heard good reports about him. The Star Greenland were for all four of Joe's horses which had been taken out for Lincolnshire, including Ponderland, soon after weights were published. Ponderland's next race was in the 7th furlongs Victoria Cup at Hurst Park, and this race is one at Ascot now after Hurst Park closed. The Irish Independent liked him for a race, as did the Scotsman. However, Liverpool Echo felt Ponderland was still light of former days, and the Sunday Post agreed. Leicester's Evening Mail listed 23 tips for the papers for the Victoria Cup, and none of them were for Ponderland. The Birmingham Daily Gazette wrote he wasn't getting much younger, and Ponderland ended up finishing completely and utterly last. In late September, the Illustrated Sporting and Dramatic News wrote that he apparently left the stage, and he certainly never won again. In December, he was sent to Newmarket sales but failed to make reserve, only reaching 4,500 guineas. Gloucester Echo in June 1926 wrote he had been bought by a British blogstock agency, but no price was mentioned. Pedigree.com wrote he was sent to France in 1926, presumably as a sire. Northern Whig wrote in June 1928 about a 2-year-old horse called Pontway, sired by Ponderland of a dam will go away. There was no such horse. There was a horse called Pontaway with a dam will go away. However, his sire was a horse called Pontyland, and it appears the paper confused South Africa with Northumberland. Illustrated Sport and Dramatic News wrote in November 1928 that Ponderland had disappointed Joel in the Classics, and that's not a fair assessment even so, as he did finish second in the Guineas. The same paper wrote in May 1931 about Joel, who had just died, and Ponderland's Derby. They say when he heard about Ponderland's lameness, he cancelled a dinner appointment and went to bed. They pretty much say that Joel decided that injury wouldn't end up being an issue. In April 1937, London Daily News described him as a sire. In the record of the sire, he sired Anouvel, who won some races in France in the early 1930s, as well as Jazz Band, Witch Doctor, and Incendiaire, who all won at least one race. Interestingly, Ponderland's full brother Panda also failed to live up to expectations, although winning at a slightly lower level. Royal Lancet won the 1922 Doncaster St Leger and the Irish St Leger. Service kit is another World War I name. Danegeld was a tax raised to pay tribute to Viking raiders to save a land from being ravished. Sun Blaze won the 1920 Richmond Stakes and 1921 Sussex Stakes. Arabesque I've already talked about in one of my Salisbury videos where the horse was winning a race. Double Tip won the 1927 2-mile Liverpool steeplechase. However, that is not in this country, but it's actually an aqueduct racecourse in the USA. Pointerland, of course, named after the from the town, came up a short while ago, and I said a journalist mixed him up with Ponderland. Olympus will be named after a Greek mountain. Knight of the Airs, and possibly another World War I name, possibly a direct reference to flying ace from France, Georges Guillemer, killed in 1917, who had shot down 54 planes. He'd been nicknamed that by Henry Bordeaux in a 1918 book. Charles Service won this race. He was owned by Edward Wigan, best known for being part of Jewish Lord's betting coups in the early 20th century known as the Confederacy. A book of Jewish Lords apparently calls him a small, extremely communicative man, fondness for milk puddings, and who pronounced the word coup as coop. The name Charles Surface comes from a character from Richard Sheldon's 1777 play The School for Scandal. He was trained by Robert Gore, I think more commonly known as Bob, and he won the 1913 Grand National as a trainer with Jerry M. But later in the 20th century, Josh Gifford trained at the same stables as Gore did. I have no idea why Brame, who I assume is Sandy Brame, is listed in the race card as the trainer. Some papers listed him as a trainer, some had it as Gore. I think Brame was a former trainer of Charles Surface, and some people may have made a mistake. It's written by Steve Donoghue. I'll link his Docupedia page, and I include two pictures here I have of him. Charles Surface made his debut on April the 11th, 1919 at Newbury when he was unplaced. In late May he won at Salisbury. The Birmingham Daily Gazette said his win was a feature of the day there, and he slammed his numerous rivals, where I felt it wasn't a particularly taking sort, he was a rare galloper. Exeter and Plymouth Gazette wrote it was an easy win, and there's been a gamble on him due to Ryder deciding to ride him instead of the stable's other runner. Daily Herald wrote he was well backed in what they call the old style. I assume they mean people backing him fearlessly. They said he won in a canter and would do further service for his owner. The Sportsman wrote later he'd won in a hollow style, expecting to win a tour plate at Windsor in June, and Belfast Telegraph tipped him for it, although he didn't win. Instead that month he won a tour plate by a neck at Newbury and was the 7-4 favourite. Both Sporting Life's Man and the Spot and also Daily Mirror tipped him. The Sportsman felt both he and the second horse were smart. Leicester Daily Post wrote people had been so impressed by Salisbury win that he's not a favourite ahead of Sparrow Spin, who was also well fancied. The Daily Telegraph, in their analysis, said it was a win for the school for scandal character. He next ran at Sandown in July. Two Sportsman correspondents, the Daily Telegraph, also Daily Chronicle, Daily Mirror, Daily Express and the Yorkshire Evening Post all tipped him to win, but he finished second with Birmingham Daily Gazette feeling his chances were very flattering at one point. However, he was eventually beaten 3 lengths as a 2-1 favourite. Sheffield Independent wrote it was ding-dong between him and winner Mary Din, and many papers wrote it was a good struggle. Charles Surface won at another Kempton meeting which was held in Sandown in August. Belfast Newsletter wrote they had great respect for him in the race. Whole Daily Mail tipped him after he won the Scotsman, and the Yorkshire Post wrote he won in fine style. Birmingham Daily Gazette felt he was more of a useful juvenile. Sheffield Daily Telegraph wrote he beat the favourite easily and again mentioned where his name came from. Scotsman said he won stylish and had a good chance of a prominent position in the 3 handicap ratings at the end of the season. They wrote he was a nice horse, but unfortunately a gelding. Clearly meant he couldn't be used for breeding when he retired. Charles Silver's final race of the season saw him finish third at Leaford as 92-second favourite. In April 1921 at the Greenham Stakes in Newbury, several independent wrote before the race he attracted a lot of notice, and Leicester Daily Post wrote there was a lot to like about him. The Sporting Times wrote he was consistent. However, Charles Silver finished unplaced. He was then unplaced at Hurst Park in May and last at Salisbury in July. November, the Sporting Times wrote he hadn't progressed during the season. Later that month, the Yorkshire Evening Post and Pall Mall Gazette sent him to Gore to prepare for a hurdling career, and he ended up staying with for flat racing as well. Starting from 9:21, I do all these races of each year in data order, not do a flat and jump separately. Charles Service made his hurdling debut at Sandown on February 5th, 1921. He was tipped by the Daily Mail, Sporting Chronicle and the Daily Graphic. He was then placed at 8-1. Winter 1921 version of Rough Sky managed to forget his Sandown win of the National Index for that year, so making it look like he didn't win at all, although it did list his win in the results themselves. Parkham Flat was 4th of the Old Lewis course in Sussex. The Sheffield Daily Telegraph felt he ran on well and should be borne in mind. When a surprising won another Sussex course, this time Gatwick in August, was surprised by realising he won at all, because Rough Sky again that year only misses 2 flat wins, the actual 3 ones. Portal Chronicle felt he'd do better with further. The next race was at Kempton October in the corner looking at today. He was leading all the way as a 6-1 second favourite. London Weekly Dispatch felt he was a big order and the race won at practically every point. The Sporting Chronicle wrote he had been beat for speed all the way. The Yorkshire Post wrote he showed great improvement in his 2 previous races this season, and his victory was assured some way from home. At this point I realised something was wrong, as I had no idea until that point he'd actually won at Gatwick. The Illustrated Sporting and Dramatic News wrote that the presence of Mr. Purefoy, who didn't go racing much, made people think he was at Kempton to see Charles Surface. This made people back the horse, and the paper said it was lucky fluke, as Purefoy said after he had no idea the horse was running and hadn't bet on him. I assume it's Wilfred Bagwell Purefoy, but I had no idea why people would think he had a connection with Charles Surface. Horse ran again over hurdles in December at Hurst Park. Not even Post wrote he'd shown he was as adept over hurdles as he was over flats. Now, unless the journalist has seen schooling, but a bit of an odd comment, as the paper clearly states his Sandown win in February is his only race, and didn't run all that well then. By the way, the spring 1923 Rough Sky does mention this race, it goes back to winter 1921. Well, winter 1921 edition ends a little earlier, and so didn't know about it. Yorkshire Post selected Charles Silvers to win, as did the Daily Mirror. The Era said he was much hopeful to win. The end he finished third. After the race, Sporting Chronicle wrote he did not jump well but stayed on for a place. 1922 was unplaced over jumps above Kempton in January and Sandown in February. Later in February won at Lingford at 5-1, with a 3-1 favourite Rattlesnake falling at the first hurdle, leading Charles Silvers to win easily. For London Weekly Dispatch pointed out it taking him 2 seasons to win a hurdle race. The Daily Herald wrote he won away the race, and the Sheffield Daily Telegraph wrote he was in a tight rein. The Yorkshire Post wrote he won in a canter. Western Morning News wrote he won easily. The Yorkshire Post, Daily Herald and the Kilkenny Moderator tipped him to win a maiden hurdle at Gatwick in March. That's not a mistake, as the race conditions make it clear this is a maiden and closing race. And I point out on other occasions these are races only had to be a maiden when the entry is closed. The end Charles Service is in place at Gatwick of a 7-4 favourite. The Yorkshire Post saying he failed to run up to expectations. Later in March he won at Lingfield as 6-4 favourite, but by 5 lengths. He wasn't entered for possible flat engagement in Epsom in April. Western Mail wrote that he could run away the race if he tried to. He did return to flat racing in May, was second at Kempton, and the Yorkshire Post wrote the Finnick winner King saw a little difficulty keeping him at bay. Belfast Newsletter wrote that Charles Service was fit and well, and later in May he won by a head at Brighton at 8-1. Daily Mail called it a fine race with him and Golly Eyes. A different tipster from Mr. Butler, who I mentioned earlier, but of course could have been the same person, stated in capital letters 3 times an advert, pointing out that he tipped him at 8-1. A little while later, the Sporting Illustrated Thematic News had a picture of a Brighton finish. Dundee Even Telegraph said they've been advised never to miss backing Charles Surface as selling races over 6 furlongs. Leeds Mercury had an answer to a correspondent called FBW from Kirkstall how Charles Surface was scratched from the Earlswood Handicap at Hurst Park at 9 a.m. on July the 17th. I have no idea what specifically that question related to. Charles Surface was unplaced at Lingfield in July before winning back at Lewis in August by half a length again at 8-1. The Daily Mirror had tipped him, but the Birmingham Daily Gazette hadn't liked him for the race. Westminster Gazette said he won comfortably, when Leeds Mercury and Freeman's Journal wrote he won cleverly. The Western Mail wrote he won easily. London Daily News said a good shoot judges thought he would win, and it was a good horse when in the mood. Illustrated Sporting Thematic News says it's strange that Gore wasn't a trainer of flat horses as well as hurdlers. However, claimed that when he gets a material he usually obtains a result on the flat. A couple of weeks later, the Dublin Sport said Charles Service had led Gore to an unknown destination. October was unplaced at Kempton while trying to win today's race 2 years in a row. The whole Daily Mail and Daily Mirror said he ran well, and in fact he was still trained by Gore. In December he was back again unplaced at Kempton, although tipped by Western Morning News and the Yorkshire Post. Sheffield Daily Telegraph there was quite a fury in the betting market. He went off 7-4 favourite, so he's fairly smart last season but ran badly here. Daily Mail wrote his jumping was clumsy and laboured, and he seemed to lose heart having to make up ground between the hurdles. Yorkshire Post said his jumping was indifferent. The Belfast Newsletter said they'd never seen him with a winning chance during the race. He ended this year with a second place at Lingfield, although he was beaten 10 lengths. 1923 was 4th at Hurst Park in January, and then second at Kempton later that month. Exeter and Plymouth Gazette had tipped him to win, feeling a return to his best form. Sunday Courier didn't tip him, saying he runs very inconsistently, but if willing to do his best he would be very hard to beat, and he lost by half a length. The Sheffield Daily Telegraph wrote he stuck tenaciously to his task. Western Mail felt Red Hill, who had also won the race, had won by easier over the half-length winning margin. However, Scotsman felt the exact opposite, and Charles Surface may have won had he consented to put his best foot forward. February Belfast Newsletter wrote he was inconsistent, but could just about win that day on his best form, although he was a non-runner. Western Mail also tipped him that day. Northern Whig selected him in March, a race again, though he didn't run in it. And his next actual one was at Kempton back in May and back on the flat. The Dundee Courier though said he always ran well here. Well, he didn't today, as he was unplaced. At the end of May he was second at Lingfield. Daily Mirror felt before his next one at Gatwick in June that he ran well at Lingfield. He said he'd be hard to beat if consenting to do his best. Robson gave him a chance, saying they'd written him down as a winner of a smaller race, or feeling he gives his best winning where turf is yielding. In terms of going descriptions nowadays, the word yielding is only used in Irish racing and is similar to good to soft. Though Charles Surface ended up third at Gatwick. Not Evening Post felt it was a really good run, but he was unplaced at Brighton also in June. Later in July, the Jumbo felt he was a moderate plater, though he may win a seller in the future. I didn't think it would be anything much better class than a seller. Chipper some papers for a race at Glorious Gould in August, but didn't win. In fact, the Yorkshire Post made him their nap that day for selling plate. He also tipped by 3 papers for Brighton race early that month, and again he didn't win. Finally reappeared that month at Lewis. For Leeds Mercury wrote he missed several races and was likely to be fancied. This was a race he won the meeting the year before. However, Sportsman felt the opposition this year was much more formidable, and the Scotsman felt in some of his form where he had a chance of repeated success. Master Evening News wrote afterwards a great finish, Katie beating Charles Service by a neck, with Peter Dicker further neck back in third, and the Sportsman said it was a splendid race. Scotsman wrote it was a desperate set too between the three of them. Charles Service won at Gatwick in September. Not even post thought he was likely to win. It was also tipped by Soul in the Sporting Life, the Daily Mail, Westminster Gazette and the Morning Advertiser. The Sportsman felt the softer going would suit him, but tipped Irish Eagle. The race was ran twice for fascinating reasons. Charles Service finished third, but there was a dead heat between Irish Eagle and Retaliate. What happened, which wouldn't happen now, is the race was re-ran between Irish Eagle and Retaliate, the last horse winning by 6 lengths. Given it was only a 6 furlong race, it may not have been too hard for those two horses. Later in September, Charles Service was placed at the old Folkestone Racecourse in Kent. Exeter and Plymouth Gazette wrote beforehand he was well treated and been running consistently, but hadn't won. Daily Chronicle and also Vigilant from the Sportsman had tipped him. Toby won at Gatwick was selected by Man of the Sport and also Soling from the Sporting Life, Daily Mail, Daily Graphic, Daily Chronicle and the Sportsman. The latter's paper said he would win if caught in the right mood. However, again he wasn't placed as 2-1 favourite. Yorkshire Post afterwards saying he'd evidently soured of racing. Northern Whig wrote again he had failed, and the Sportsman said he was a false favourite. He was back over jumps at Kempton in December. Sunday Post wrote that even if he failed here, he would certainly win in the near future. Yorkshire Post said he'd given plenty of work on the flat that year and had shown an aptitude for hurdling at the course in January. Sportsman wrote he looked in the pink of condition and had it the day before when he might have won but in the end didn't won, but instead he won this day and they tipped him then. In the end he finished second. Later in December he won at Lingfield. Daily Mirror liked his run at Kempton and felt he was nicely handicapped on his best form. The Sheffield Daily Telegraph tipped him and the Northern Whig and Belfast Newsletter fancied him each way. The Destined Evening Mail made him a nap of the day, but he wasn't placed. In 1924 he started at Hurst Park in January. Over the Yorkshire Evening Post felt he had a chance. Daily Mail thought he was dangerous at the weights, but not always inclined to do his best, and was unplaced with Belfast Newsletter saying he never flattered. Correspondent for Sportsman and also Service from the Sunday Post fancied him to win back at Hurst Park in February, but again he was unplaced. Finally won the race as Evans favoured the old Isle of Wight course in May. This is his first win of any since August 1922, nearly 2 years before, and his first win since March 1922. It's more difficult than it should have been to find out this information. The National Index for Rough Scout of that year does indeed state he had a win and gives a reference number for it. However, there was a printing error, at least in my copy, and a section asterisk results are printed twice, and a section not at all. And of course, Charles Service's win was in the section not printed at all. There's not a single press comment about his win there. The only reason I knew about it was even at Isle of Wight was in May is that in a single newspaper reference in December saying he won there. Only the Sportsman appears to have mentioned the card and the result at the time. It says everything the race he won then was called a moderate hurdle. To be fair, that was a more common official race description from those times and not as quite as pejorative a description as that would be now. Back on the flat he was also unplaced at Chester in May. Later that month, Sportsman gave him a chance at Salisbury when he was third. Also gave him a chance to sell at Glorious Goodwood, but he was unplaced. He was then second at Lewis in August when ridden by Mr. Venture Paul Measer. Leicester Evening Post said he ran on gamely under his amateur jockey, who was by then in his early 50s. When I get around to uploading my video 1954 Bungay racecard I own, I talk about two bizarre incidents, including his son Harry Measer. Charles Service then unplaced at Lewis in September. In December, back over jumps, Yorkshire Post wrote for a Plumpton race. He had comparative little racing on publicans wearing a handicap for a race of this class 11 stone. Silver Spur in the Sunday Post selected him, as did the Scotsman, Sporting Chronicle, the Daily Telegraph and the Sheffield Daily Telegraph. He only didn't win, which must have been a late decision, as the newspaper race cards said he'd arrived at the course. This is why one race to the papers trying to get away not having overnight declarances, is to say if the horse has arrived and we're printing early enough, they can actually say he's a likely winner, but obviously it was a late decision not to win. Eventually he won at Lingfield that month when he was unplaced. In 1925 he was unplaced at both Gatwick and Lingfield in January. He then won at Gatwick back in February by a neck at 7-1. This time Ruskin's index has the wrong reference number. Several Daily Telegraph racing correspondent must be a fan of the play. For a third time they've now mentioned where his name came from, and no other paper has mentioned this. Westminster Gazette wrote he was once a useful horse on the flat. The Belfast Newsletter said there was a rest at 2 on the flat between him and the runner-up Prince Regent, not to be mistaken with a future Cheltenham Gold Cup winner with that name. The Northern Whig thought Charles Service won in taking fashion. Birmingham Daily Gazette felt if Prince Regent had made his effort he probably would have won. Charles Service won again in March, this time at Hurst Park. Ironically, given his win for the previous year, the horse he beat in second place was called Isle of Wight. It was a nap of a meeting for the Irish Independent at 10-1. Yorkshire Post wrote he won easily by 1 length. Another very excitable commercial tipster, this time Harry Clayton, wrote he'd been the only selection that day. The language is very similar to what I remember in 1990s adverts, and I doubt much has changed even now. Charles Surface and napped by the Leicester Evening Mail to win at Folkestone in April, but didn't run, although he was unplaced at Plumpton that month. He went back on the flat, but showed no form for his first 5 races, being unplaced at Salisbury in May, Lewis in June, Sandon in July, Brighton in August, and before 4th or 6th back at Lewis the same month. After the last race, the Scotsman wrote he showed signs of being finished with racing. October was 2nd at Lingfield. Belfast Newsletter called him a youthful performer. After race, Westminster Gazette called him Old Charles Surface, which he was by now on the flat, if not for a jump source. John Bell wrote he was leanly rated in selling handicaps and bound to score in the next week or two. In fact, his next 2 races, though, were over jumps in December. The Birmingham Daily Gazette tipped him to win in Kempton in December, so I thought he liked the course. Kempton covered the course to protect him from the frost. However, it was a much foggiest frost that meant it was abandoned, so instead he ran at Hurst Park, where the Nottingham Evening Post fancied him. The Leeds Mercury said he was useful but had a lot of weight. He finished 3rd with the Irish Independent, Sheffield Daily Telegraph, Westminster Gazette and the Leicester Evening News felt was a good run. The latter paper felt he was palpably running on, and said the same month he was fancied at Lingfield to run well. He finished 3rd, while the Westminster Gazette said he was some way behind the first 2 horses. The Liberal Echo, though, felt it was better than it looked and shouldn't be missed from supporting him next time out, and the Birmingham Daily Gazette said it was improved form. 1926, the Western Mail tipped him at Gatwick in January, as did the Birmingham Daily Gazette, who called him an old friend of theirs. The Leicester Evening News tipped him that month at Plumpton. Charles Surface's debut that year was in February in Gatwick, for a large number of journalists fancying him. Belfast Newsletter felt in his best form he might be considered a good thing. A 2 pieces of drama at heavy ground. Firstly, the Gloucester Echo and some other papers wrote he broke down 50 yards from the line, and otherwise would have finished 2nd rather than 4th. The other dramatic event was his jockey Michael Tighe was convinced he'd finished 3rd and not 4th, and brought Charles Surface up to the saddle enclosure, and the Sun Daily Echo wrote that most onlookers felt as well that he'd come 3rd. And when he ended up reading somewhere, he was obviously disappointed to find out he was actually 4th and had to go back out again. On a related note, I remember being at Sandham's Jumps meeting a few years ago. 4th and 5th places had been reversed quite quickly because of a mistake. As I was walking to pre-parade ring to watch the horses of the next race, I was rather confused at Nigel Davis with his horse, who was now 5th, wondering what was going on, and I told him they'd reversed the places. To be fair, he took it in good humour. Charles Surface ran again on the heavy ground at Lingfield that month, which I assume means he wasn't as injured as originally thought, and he was 4th again. Also finished 4th that day was Sprigg, who won the Grand National next year, and also, given what I said about the Peel case earlier, in another race had a horse in 4th place called Mr. Bumble. Charles Surface was then 3rd at Hurst Park in March, where the Nottingham Evening Post and the Sheffield Daily Telegraph felt he ran erratically. He then was back on the flat, where he showed practically no form. 4th at Gatwick in June and placed in Lingfield in July. Gatwick again unplaced in August and in September. Then at Lingfield he was yet again unplaced, this time on hard ground. He had been tipped by a few journalists in this period, and the Northern Whig in July called him aged Charles Surface. What is hardly a shock, he never ran again on the flat. Back of the jumps, he ran at Kempton in November again on heavy ground. He was 2nd here, beaten by short head. Less than a week later, he won a cellar at Sandown Park in December as 13-8 favourite by 3 lengths. The Scotsman tipped to win, as had the Belfast Newsletter, who felt to be unlucky to be beaten at Kempton. Johnny Courier wrote with many people backing his jockey George Duller. The Daily Herald wrote that Duller hit the front of the last without the slightest effort, as did the West Morning News and the Sheffield Daily Telegraph, who read the last paper also saying it was an easy win. Bob Gore bought Charles Surface back for 280 guineas after he won the cellar. He then next ran at Lingfield in December under a penalty for his Sandown win. Western Mail didn't fancy him at all in the handicap hurdle, saying he was just now a selling plater. However, was tipped by Leicester Evening Mail and Western Morning News. The end was 2nd, although the Dublin Sport felt the winner had been decisive and convincing. 1927 he started at Sandown in February, where he was very widely tipped and winning the selling hurdle of 7-4 favourite. Yorkshire Evening Post wrote that George Duller on board hardly had to move. Charles Surface's connection brought him back this time on 145 guineas. Scotsman thought probably no one else but Duller would have run on him, as the horse has to be kidded along. The same month run at Hurst Park was so widely tipped it appears the only Daily Telegraph and Northern Whig. I think the only two papers to oppose him and select anyone else. After the race, the Birmingham Daily Gazette wrote he was irresistible, winning by 6 lengths as 7-4 on favourite, and was brought back this time on for 450 guineas by his connections, which is a huge increase of 145 guineas they paid earlier in the month. And the Dundee Courier wrote there being keen competition at a subsequent auction, although thought the opposition in the race he'd run was weak. The Northampton Chronicle and Echo wrote that Lady Lindsay had been keen to bid on him. George had been on board again, and the Daily Mirror said, "Come on, George," was almost as popular slogan as "Come on, Steve" used to be on Flash. They must have meant Steve Donoghue, and for my 1953 Epsom Derby video, I also pointed out that "Come on, Gordon," as in Gordon Richards, was also a common cry on the course. After the race, the Belfast Newsletter wrote that Charles Hifford was smart. He didn't win again though until December at Kempton. The Newcastle Journal felt he would go close, but he was unplaced. In 1928, the Dundee Evening Telegraph tipped him to win a selling hurdle at Kempton in January. Oddly enough, the Daily Mirror listed runners as Charles Hifford or Noisy, as in it was going to be one or the other, and both of them were trained by Gore. In the end, Charles Hifford was the one who didn't run, and the horse, who, despite winning his sellers, was owned in the end his entire career by Mr. Wigan, never ran again. Mr. Nelke's horse would not be allowed to have that name now, shall we say. Horse George Drake is a combination of his sire, O. George, and his dam, Lady Drake. So we're here with Lady Sleeper. This is the last of the 6 races, and Lady Sleeper won this race and was owned and trained by the Nugent family. She was clearly named after her sire Sleipner and her dam Lady Charisma. She was trained by Sir Charles Nugent. The Mrs. H. Nugent who owns her might be wife of his late son Hugh or his grandson also called Hugh. Neither of their wives had the first name of H, so either be Emily or Anna respectively. She was ridden by Freddie Fox, who won all the 5 classics, and again I'll show his picture. Made her debut on March 14th at Gatwick, where she was unplaced. She was third there back in June, and then in November, only 2 days after being unplaced in Manchester, she finished second at the same course. In 1921, she was third at Birmingham and a close finish between the first 3. London Daily News feeling it was a good performance. Third again, this time at Gatwick in May, where the Northampton Chronicle and Echo, before the race, described her as useful. Later months, she was third or fourth at Wolverhampton at 9-4 favourite, then second at Windsor, and 5 days later she was second again. It doesn't sound too interesting until he realised it was in the Oaks. It's a filly who hadn't won any of her previous 8 races, and I'm surprised she was only 25-1. And still, the Daily Mirror did call her rank outsider. So how many colts and mares have been placed as maidens of British classics, especially with that many runs? Moultrie Star was second at 50-1 of this year's Derby, but had only 2 runs, finishing second in both. Certainly better form than Lady Sleipner had. Lady Sleipner then ran at Gatwick later in the same month on hard ground. The papers overwhelmingly tipped her to, and the Nottingham Post headline afterwards was Lady Sleeper's usual luck, and it wasn't good luck. She was third 11-10 favourite. Birmingham Daily Gazette stated the method in which she was handled occasioned considerable comment. She was drawn to the inside and ended up in the middle of a course, and I felt the result in no way enhanced the form of the Oaks. Illustrated Sporting and Dramatic News felt a career one showed the fillies were sadly a moderate lot if she were able to finish second in the Oaks. Next month they wrote following the Gatwick run that she had shown no form since the Oaks second. Daily Mirror wrote they alleged 2 good things at Gatwick, which included Lady Sleipner, were both well beaten, and they said she looked to have a soft task but yet managed to get beaten to 3rd place. Belfast Newsletter said the performance was a sad reflection of the Oaks form, and said her jockey Mason had ridden her most tenderly and never moved on her when it looked like she only needed a little shaking up to win. And they said the jockey had no explanation for why, which apparently is, they said, a standard Nugent. The Leeds Mercury headline was surprised to defeat a Lady Sleipner. Western Morning News and Belfast Newsletter had similar headlines. The former paper said her presence had made many owners not run their horses, because obviously they thought they had no chance of winning. It also said that when she hit the front of halfway, it looked like she would score in easy fashion. Sheffield Daily Telegraph said she looked the winner when taking command at halfway. There's a possibility it wins her later that month. The Nottingham Evening Post said she's a good thing for a major handicap if it hadn't been for feeble, as they wrote it, a Gatwick display. And next one is at Leicester in the Leicestershire Oaks. Sporting Chronicle felt she was well, and Western Morning News tipped her. However, she finished back in 3rd place with a dead heat. The Western Mail afterwards said she was by far the best looking fillies in the race and a big handsome animal. However, obviously she was not as good as she looked, and the display was a disappointing one. Sporting Chronicle felt she was short of speed. Both as newsletters said she disappointed. It's again a possibility of 4 race, this time at Birmingham in August. Although she didn't win Leicester Evening Mail, who tipped her, so they were given one more chance. They couldn't believe her recent form was correct, as they made out runners in the Oaks to be a poor lot. Later in the month, the Nottingham Evening Post said she was a very disappointing filly. Northern Whig considered for Cambridgeshire. It's remarkable that Oaks second was set to carry 6 stone 3 versus the top weight of 9 stone 4. I was fairly scarcely credible. If even then she was so little fancied, she was 200 to 1 anti-post. I'll admit it, the distance might have been a short stand for her, but frankly the whole thing is amazing. By October early on, she was 25 to 1. The next race was in October on this card today, when finally she won a race on a 12th effort. This was a maiden at closing race, and what he said, all that meant is when the entries were done, you had to be a maiden, and the entry was done on September 13th, so you could actually have run out the one win after September 13th and still qualified for this race. The Sporter Chronicle said it wouldn't be a surprise if she did run well here at Kempton, because she was ridiculously well treated, which frankly she certainly was. Boxing World and Mirror of Life agreed, but felt she seemed very erratic, never winning the same way twice, and otherwise holding a chance second to none. Our first Scotsman said she would be now in the picture for Cambridgeshire after a walk, as in basically effectively a walkover as he cruised home at Kempton. They said she carried no penalty, and Malaya offered her to lose £17,000 at 25 to 1. As a total of £17,000, not £70,000 at 25 to 1, certainly not in those days. The night before Kempton race may have some cause for reflection. How they wonder what lightweight jockey would ride her at 6 stone 3 before they thought of supporting her. Amazing to think what jockeys were weighing in those days. Next month, the Sheffield Independent wrote she won in Kempton in a canter. Illustrated Sporting Batic News for all the Oaks fillies while winning Love and Idlers was so mournfully moderate. But the Chronicle wrote she was going well in her Cambridge preparation, but the rain was badly needed. Bystander felt she needed to be regarded for caution for the race. Anyway, the Yorkshire Evening Post reported that both Lady Steepner and Newton's other Cambridgeshire hopes were coughing and would miss the race. The Sheffield Daily Telegraph gave the alternative explanation for next month, but it was due to the hard ground. She appeared at Windsor in November, where Birmingham Daily Gazette wrote she was a hot favourite. However, they also wrote she broke her saddle, delayed the start and drifted in the market, ending up last as 3 to 1 favourite. White Knight Leeds Mercury actually gave an apology, quite a strong apology as well, almost a heartfelt one for selecting her, as they felt they had never had a more confident tip than her. Though she did say when she'd been saddled, she suddenly became very fretful, was sweating profusely, and the saddle had also broken. It's now only set to carry 6 stone 4 in Manchester's November handicap. With the advertiser mentioned among the lightweights for the race, but added an exclamation mark after saying she's second in the Oaks. Obviously, it's astonished that anyone who was second in the Oaks is offered 6 stone 4. And she did win in Manchester in the midst, set 8 to 1 in November, having been tipped by the Illustrated Sporting News on Leeds and Mercury. After the Manchester Evening News said she always looked like winning. The Western Morning News felt she won cleverly. Stafford Senator and the Panmure Gazette wrote she won easily, and both said having no penalties, she might win a November handicap the next day. As I said, this is the same race, which is now won at Doncaster after Manchester Racecourse closed. The Sporter Chronicle said she'd been a very disappointing animal, with only success prior to a Manchester win being in a small plater at Kempton, which of course is a card I own. Next day, this paper said they didn't fancy her for the November handicap even without a penalty. Yorkshire Post agreed with her being disappointing, but after Manchester win, she was clearly a more capable animal than her record would suggest. After the November handicap, the Sporting Chronicle wrote she was prominent 2 furlongs out, preferred to go through to the end, and she was unplaced. In 1922, she only reappeared at Manchester in June, when she was 4th, with the Birmingham Daily Gazette tipping her. All British meetings for that week were actually run at hard ground, partly as late May had seen an exceptional heat wave. The next ran at Newmarket Rolling Mail, where the same paper tipped her again, but this time she was unplaced. London Daily News wrote a lot of money must be lost on her. Western Mail felt the distance was just too far for her, which does seem odd for an Oaks placed horse. There's only a 1 mile race. Sporting News felt she was very fit. Next she ran back on today's card in October, but this time in Duke of York handicap of 1.25 miles. According to Daily Racing Form, she called a delay of 10 minutes by going to start leisurely, and the steward severely reprimanded Nugent for giving instructions without official sanction. The Yorkshire Post wrote she arrived late, and the Belfast newsletter said there was a necessary delay, while little Tommy Morgan, as they called him, walked her all the way to the start. They said Nugent was quite rightly reprimanded by the stewards afterwards, and the Illustrated Sporting Dramatic News also condemned the actions of the connections. Newcastle Daily Chronicle said that Nugent had given orders for her to be walked, as he felt he might run away. Turned to Newmarket Rolling Mail the same month, and this time won. So the Daily Telegraph said he drifted with betting to 8 to 1, but before shortening down to 92 second favourite. Westminster Gazette wrote when she does her best, she really is a good mare, They accepted a chance in a Cambridgeshire of only 6 stone 12. Freeman's Journal of Western Wales, who won that previous race in their canter. Scotsman and Belfast Newsletter felt it was a smart display. Northern Whig wrote she won a tight way. Birmingham Daily Gazette wrote she ran away completely from the field. And the Sunday Mirror wrote she slammed the field, while the Daily Mirror made similar comments. Northampton Chronicle Echo pointed out she wouldn't currently extra weight of a Cambridgeshire for that race. But the London Daily News made a point, but same point last year, you need a jockey light enough to do that weight. The Daily Mail felt at Cambridge the chances are not good, and the Sunday Illustrator felt she would not do well under a lightweight jockey, as had been said with Nugent, where the horse would run away. A much lighter weight jockey would perhaps have trouble controlling her. Leeds Mercury wrote she disappointed in her Cambridge trial, and she did run in the Cambridge in that October, but was unplaced. Next one at Manchester in November, where she was second as 3-1 favourite by half a length, the Daily Mail having tipped her. Afterwards, Leeds Mercury said she was afraid she had not the heart for a fight. For 3rd successive years she won twice at this Manchester meeting, and 2 days later she was 4th as 7-2 second favourite, having, according to a Palma Gazette, been gambled down from 6-1. December Birmingham Daily Gazette said she had put on such a disappointing show in Cambridge, which is actually a rather odd story. They wrote about the sale of the late Sir William Nelson stud, and mentioned Lady Steepton had been retained for 1,150 guineas, which they felt was the right price for her, in spite of her exceptionally good looks. I think meaning you don't want to pay any more for her. The issue is I don't know any connection between Lady Steepton and William Nelson. She was owned by the Nugent family beforehand and afterwards as well. January 18th, 1923, she made her hurdles debut at Newbury. The Yorkshire Post pointed out she and another horse were friendless in the betting market, and Lady Steepton led for the first half mile before running out, which the Daily Mirror felt added to the excitement. She then ran at February at Kempton, and Exeter and Plymouth Gazette received a good account of her, and the London Daily News tipped her. Afterwards, the Daily Herald said she was at the tail end of the field. They said this is a great disappointment, as they understood she could do smart things at home. Birmingham Daily Gazette rather blamed a bad mistake 5 hurdles out for her performance. Western Morning News felt she jumped to triumph big at some of the obstacles. In March, she got a couple of tips for Wolverhampton Hurdle but didn't run. She did run that month at Sandown. It wasn't her fault she didn't get far. She was brought down at the first hurdle. Why, after these 2 unplaced efforts to third career run, she's running the Imperial Cup is another matter. I think it's still a relatively major hurdle race then. She was then unplaced at Aintree a week later, and that was it for her hurdling career. Back on the flat, she was second at Kempton, beaten by a Necker's 5-1 favourite. Nottingham Evening Post said she was fit from hurdling and stated this is always known as a good criterion at this part of a flat season. Northern Whig felt she was shaping very well, and that the winner before weakening rapidly and just getting beaten. She won a Newbury Spring Cup on heavy ground. Palma Gazette felt she was light-weighted and ran well last time out. She had a chance in her early two-year-old form, and she's one of 2 tips for the race by the Sportsman. The Dundee Courier thought she wouldn't stay a mile, which is bizarre, and it's for a horse of second Yokes. That's the second time we heard someone saying a horse second of Yokes wouldn't stay basically a mile. And in the end, though, she wasn't placed. She won at Kempton in May, where she was second by half a length of the Daily Herald felt the winner won comfortably, and in that race she did actually beat Charles Surface, who was finished further back. Birmingham Daily Gazette wrote she was going well all the way through and was coming back to her best form. In June, the Edinburgh Evening News reported her fit and well, and she was declared to races in June, including Royal Hunt Cup at Ascot. However, she was scratched from all her possible engagements before the race and never ran again. She was Dan Oracle, who ran 10 times on the flat in 1929 and 1930 with few placed efforts but no wins. King George V's horse down here was Bullwood. That may be a mistake, as it's the same name as his sire, and it's probably wrong, as one of my 2 Salisbury videos I talk about a horse having the same name as her dam, and that was a blunder. And end with, Stornoway's name is a combination of her sire Stornoway and her dam, Mistress Nell. Thanks for listening.